Hello, welcome back. This is Dr. Jordan again, and for the next couple of hours, I'll be talking about 19th century Romanticism. Um, and this music basically kind of encompasses most of the 19th century from about 1820 or so to all the way through up until, 1910, I guess you would say. Um, And the composers we're going to be dealing with are composers like Schubert, Berlioz, Brahms, Wagner, Verdi, Tchaikovsky, Mahler. Um, these are all important figures in 19th century Western European music. And their music is still played and enjoyed today by hundreds of thousands of people live and in recordings. It's played all over the United States, and it it's really wonderful stuff. I can't recommend it more highly. So let's launch into the context of the 19th century here. Um, the the whole context is very, very different from the uh, the Viennese classical music that we've been listening to. And the composer that really kind of helps to get the ball rolling is Beethoven. Beethoven is the model that people look to in the 19th century. Um, and it scared them because uh, most of these composers are either consciously or subconsciously comparing themselves to Beethoven. Am I writing music as great as Beethoven's music? And usually in their minds, I think the answer was no. Brahms, for instance, only composed four symphonies. Beethoven composed nine. Brahms only composed four, simply because the prospect of writing a symphony frightened him to death. He, he worked on his first symphony for 20 years, um, and just to get it right, because basically he's haunted by this ghost of Beethoven. Um, so yeah, so this this 19th century music, though, is also in response to a number of developments that changed the context for them in the 19th century. For one thing, the French Revolution finally draws to a close in 1815, and uh, the response to Napoleon is to try to put everything back in the box. You know how it is when you buy something at the store and it comes neatly packed in a nice box, and you take it out and use it, and then you try to put it back in the box and it doesn't fit. We've all had that experience. Please, it got into the box the first time. Why isn't it fitting? And that's what's happening politically here. They try to put the same old kings on the same old thrones, um, and and it doesn't work. That old feudal system that was in place before the French Revolution doesn't work in the 19th century, and yet they try to make it work. And this creates a great deal of frustration and anxiety. And also, there are attempts to overthrow these governments, uh, one after another. And the response ends up being nationalism. Um, these kings and queens and dukes and earls, no, they don't have any legitimacy anymore. So they turn to nationalism. You know, I am the head of this country and it's a great country, and right or wrong, it's our country and we all need to pull together to make it a great country. So this nationalism becomes very popular. In fact, two new nations are formed in Europe during this period. Um, in the north, we get uh, the rise of Germany. Germany had not been a real nation up to this point. And Bismarck and the Kaiser Wilhelm I create this German nation. Um, and by 1870, Germany is a nation. They even call themselves an empire. The Kaiser is literally, it means Caesar. So, yeah, so the German Empire, so called, is created. In the South, we have the formation of Italy. Italy had never not been a country since Roman times. And now, again, by about 1870, 1865, 70, Italy becomes a country. It's united as a country. So, and we'll talk about how that influences the music because, composers begin uh, getting interested in writing music that reflects the character of their respective nations. And that's still going on today, of course. The other thing, of course, is a huge, huge influence on composers, and it's the Industrial Revolution. The picture you see there is coal miners. The Industrial Revolution is powered by coal. Coal is burned in these factories to power these textile mills in cities like Manchester and Liverpool, steel mills in Birmingham and England. And of course, this Industrial Revolution gets passed over to Germany, France, Spain, Italy. All these countries begin their own versions of the Industrial Revolutions. And of course, in the United States, we see massive economic growth powered by uh, this capitalistic ethos. Uh, and a lot of Americans get very rich overnight uh, using these methods of mass distribution, mass production. Um, Carnegie, Rockefeller, um, Jay Gould in railroads. The list goes on. J.P. Morgan, the banking magnate. It goes on and on. So the Industrial Revolution really changes how people live. They come off the farms and they work in a coal mine, and there you see them packed like sardines in an elevator that's going to go down hundreds of feet and mine coal to burn in not just in factories but to heat homes during the winter. Um, so Industrial Revolution era cities look like this: factories belching coal dust into the air, homes being heated with coal, belching coal dust into the air. And guess what color the cities are? Well, you can have any color you want as long as it's black. And air pollution is horrible. It's everywhere. People are hacking up a lung everywhere you turn. Tuberculosis is rampant because the tenements where the factory workers live are crowded and filthy. Um, so diseases like cholera, tuberculosis, typhus are rampant in these places. Cities are just nasty places. You don't want to live in a city. Um, and so, part of the Romantic movement is this back to nature idea. And we'll see that reflected in composers and artists. Nature becomes almost an obsession with these people. Henry David Thoreau, in Walden Pond, where he goes out there to meditate and come up with his idea of nonviolent resistance. You don't have to follow all the laws. Some laws are unjust, and you have a moral obligation to fight against them. He came up with those ideas by going back to nature. Um, and Niagara Falls, in the United States, it became a tourist destination. People wanted to see Niagara Falls and spend time there uh, because it was so wonderful compared to the cities where they basically are trapped as workers and as clerks, as various sorts of other people working for these factory bosses. Um, they're trying to get out. So a lot of the painting, a lot of the music centers on the beauty of nature, and you know we create parks in cities. We create national parks. That's one of the greatest ideas the United States ever came up with, and it's created as a part of this romantic ethos to enjoy the beauty of nature and get away from the ugliness of the city. Um, Immanuel Kant plays a role in this too. Kant says, and he's right about this, he says that reality is something that the mind perceives. The world isn't really as we see, hear, feel, taste, or touch it. Our brains create reality. And we're going to see some examples of that with poems by Goethe and others in the 19th century who kind of basically take off where Kant began. Um, so that's an interesting dynamic. Karl Marx, of course, created a political and economic theory based on the radical inequality that he saw in England. Marx was German, but he lived in, I believe, Manchester in England, and he was deeply disturbed by the way that textile workers and other factory workers were treated. Long hours, low pay, dangerous working conditions, living in filthy tenements. And he said, these people are actually creating the wealth that these factory owners enjoy. So why don't they revolt and take over the factories and run them themselves and divide up the proceeds, the profits evenly amongst them? So radical economic equality is what Marx was all about. Believe it or not, he was inspired, even though he didn't believe in God, he was inspired by the New Testament. Right in the book of Acts, in the second chapter, the newly born Christians sell everything they have and give it to the apostles, who distribute it to everybody in the community according to their needs. It's in the New Testament. So there you have it. So communism is born here. This economic theory. Does it work? No. Some would say it's never been tried, but it became an excuse for tyranny in the 20th century, using the rhetoric of communism to justify all kinds of horrible tyrannical behavior. So, yeah. So Marx comes up with a new theory, and it's a theory that hasn't worked very well, and it's pretty much defunct today, except for North Korea and Cuba. And there you have it. Yes, no doubt you've heard about Darwin. Darwin made this famous voyage to the Galapagos Island, where he observed changes in various species of birds and mammals from island to island, and he came up with this theory of evolution based on natural selection. How that species go through these genetic mutations to survive, and the fittest of these species survives and gets to spread its genes to the next generation, and these genetic mutations are passed on based on what's bird or lizard survives as a result. So it's the theory of evolution. Yes, it's true. But, and here's a big but, it's not true as far as human society is concerned. After Darwin published his Origin of Species, it didn't take long for some people to say, well, some people are more highly evolved than others. And so we get something called social Darwinism, which is a distortion of Darwin's theory. But it's still used by filthy rich Americans to justify their filthy richness. And even preachers took it. A guy named Benjamin Strong was was a tremendously important figure, because he basically said social Darwinism was Christian. This is around 1900 that he's preaching this, and so today we have dozens of Benjamin Strongs and dozens of pulpits across the country preaching the prosperity gospel, which is a kind of social Darwinism. Um, I'm rich because I survived the jungle, and I have emerged as the most fit to survive, and that's why I'm filthy rich. And don't you don't have the right to take my money away. Um, so I'm not paying any taxes. It goes on and on like that. So yeah, and if I was rich, I might believe that too. So, but I'm not, so I don't. Anyway, that's Darwin and the various distortions of Darwin. Uh, Unfortunately, the biggest and worst social Darwinist who ever lived was Adolf Hitler. Um, and yeah, um, that's why social Darwinism became somewhat unpopular until recently, when it's been reborn again, sadly. Wellhausen, the guy you've never heard of. There's a good reason you've never heard of Julius Wellhausen. um, your local preacher, if you go to church, knows all about Julius Wellhausen. Trust me on this. They study him in seminary. So if you go to seminary, you will hear a lot about Julius Wellhausen, but you're not going to preach on it. Why is that? Well, he said the Bible isn't written by who you think it was written by. He's, uh, this documentary hypothesis, it broke up the 5 books of Moses, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. He said there are basically 4 scribes that constructed these 5 books. And they didn't live at the same time as Moses. Okay, Moses lived around what, 1250 BCE, somewhere in there. And so the Exodus is what, the 1230s BCE. But he said, yeah, the earliest people that wrote these things down, maybe they had some prior legends that they were listening to, stuff like that. He said they lived around 1000 BCE, 300-400 years after Moses, if Moses existed at all. Okay, and they basically took some local legends and some tales around the campfire and added their own sorts of theological suppositions to it, and they wrote it down. Um, about 300 years after that, another group of scribes or scribe came along and added his 2 cents to it. And then about 100 years after that guy, um, another school of scribes or a scribe came along and edited it all, put it all together, and added a bunch of their own stuff. And the the Torah was born, the Pentateuch was born. So that's the theory, and it's never been really adequately refuted. Um, and there's archaeological evidence to support it. Okay, so that's Wellhausen. There are a number of other scholars that came before and after Wellhausen that basically added to this theory, and yeah, the documentary hypothesis is alive and well today and shows uh, every possibility of continuing long into the future. So, when you start fooling with the Bible, you really, really tick off a lot of evangelical preachers and evangelicals themselves. When you say it's not written by Moses, you know, people get very defensive. And so fundamentalism is kind of a response to this. And yeah, that affects the music and the culture as well. So Nietzsche came along towards the end of the 19th century, and Nietzsche's madman in his book, Thus Spake Zarathustra, uh, exclaimed that God is dead and we have killed him. And, you know, the idea that God is dead and we have killed him is not something to get upset about. In essence, yeah, we have substituted um, all kinds of things for God. We always do anyway. And but this idea that of progress and we're doing better and better, and due to our own efforts, uh, right, we can change the world and make it a better place to live in, and we don't need God to help us do that. We don't need God to explain the origins life. Darwin did that effectively, even though Darwin was very religious himself. So we don't need God to heal because we modern science can discover how to treat and manage disease. On and on and on. So we trust in science, we trust in progress rather than in God. Okay, so that's kind of what Nietzsche is saying, and I think that idea of trusting in progress and in science, and it can help us. That's partially true, but also science has given us things like machine guns, AK-47s, the atomic weapons, um, all this stuff we can use to really, really do serious damage to ourselves and to the planet we live in. So don't get the idea that um, progress is all positive. I mean, there's a dark underside as well. And I think Nietzsche saw that, and that's why his Madman he is quoted there. So all this creates an anti-modern reaction. In the United States, it's fundamentalism. In Europe, it was Pius IX, the Pope who was elected Pope in 1848, and he was on the papal throne for many, many years. He's one of the longest serving popes in history. And when the papal lands were taken away from him by the Italian nationalists, uh, he reacted angrily. And so there was this really interesting split between the papacy and Italy as a nation. So and of course they had to take the lands away just to to reunite the nation. And thereafter, right, reuniting Italy, and the Pope was in the way, and the papal lands were he had a huge he owned a huge amount of land right in the middle of Italy. So they took it all away, and the Pope reacted angrily, and so we get this anti-modern reaction, and you see it in the Catholic Church and in various Protestant churches today. Churches are splitting all the time over this sort of thing, and it's a reaction against this idea of progress and scientific knowledge, and let's go back. Uh, let's get back to the good old days when everything was just fine. Well, of course, there never were any good old days, and everything was never just fine. Nevertheless, with Pius IX, we see that. So again, the French Revolution really did not, it failed. And so these tyrants were back on the thrones of these nations, ruling these countries. Um, and so there were a great many revolutions that took place after this to try to bring democracy, representative democracy, to these countries in Europe. There was a huge uprising in 1848, which failed everywhere. And it created a lot of refugees that came to, guess where, the United States. So especially in Germany, all these German guys, uh, there's a bounty out for them. They're going to be arrested and put in prison for many years. So they fled Germany and they came to the United States. And they were called 48ers. And so we have a huge influx of Germans coming into the country after 1848. Um, and uh, Wagner himself, the German opera composer, fled to Switzerland and spent 20 years in exile in Switzerland writing operas. So you see that. So there is this desire for representative democracy, and eventually these countries do get some form of that. We see a gradual change uh, in England where you have the monarch, but you also have Parliament, and Parliament begins to have more and more power, um, and uh, the monarchs begin to have less and less until by the end of the 19th century, the king is no longer really running the government. The king is a kind of a symbol of the nation rather than somebody who actually gets his hands dirty with the day-to-day operation of government. That's left up to the prime minister and the government and parliament. So you see that gradual change taking place over the years in the 19th century. Um, but again, part of it is due to the fact that these kings have no legitimacy. They turn to nationalism to justify uh, what they're doing. So, and nationalism looks awfully good during this period. Hooray, we are Frenchmen. Frenchmen are the best. Of course, when Germany becomes a country, they immediately try to create this nationalistic sense of pride. Hooray, we're now Germany, and Germany is the best, and Italy as well. So we get this, and of course, the English have always been that way to an extent. So we get these composers writing nationalistic music, and we're going to hear about that. The problem is in Austria, right? Austria is ruling over this huge area of Central Europe, and there's no sense of nationality at all because they all speak different languages, they have slightly different cultures, sometimes different religious practices. So in Austria they speak German. In Czechoslovakia, right, Bohemia, Moravia, they speak Czech. Over in Hungary, they're speaking Hungarian. Uh, right, in Croatia, they have Serbo-Croatian they're speaking. So there's no linguistic kind of uniformity there. It's a very different kind uh, of deal. So the Habsburgs who rule this thing are wondering, what do we do with this? But so it's hard for them to create that sense. But in France, of course, it's fairly easy. France has been a country for a long time. Germany, they all speak one dialect or another of German, so they have a tough row to hoe there, but eventually they get around to it. Same in Italy. Trust me, the dialects abound in Italy, but they all end up eventually speaking Italian, um, and that's how to unify the country there. That's Liberty Leading the People by Delacroix, the Romantic painter, and that's just a fabulous painting. But it embodies the sense of the revolutionary sense that we're trying to create more equality in a place that's very unequal, and so people are dying. The spirit of liberty with the tricolor flag, the French flag, is rallying the troops to basically try to bring representative democracy to, in this case, France. Um, so that, and the idea that this can only arise out of some sort of conflict is a big idea in the 19th century. We have to fight for this. Um, and so we see that in America as well. So we were born in a war, and so we're going to fight to achieve equality for brotherhood and liberty, whatever that means. And another thing about 19th century art and culture is the look back to the medieval past. You know, in the 18th century and in the 17th century and in the 16th century, the humanists and their descendants were looking to Greco-Roman antiquity. And so everything, the operas are always about, Roman history or Greek myths. Orpheus, right? The coronation of Poppaea. Mozart's the Mercy of Titus, La Clemenza di Tito, is that way. So that these people are always looking to Greco-Roman antiquity, but here in the 19th century, they're done with that. You may be glad, but they're done with it. They're done with it, and they look at medieval artists, writers, stories, King Arthur, and the Holy Grail, Roman Catholic Christianity, and Dante. So here is Dante being led through hell by Virgil. Remember Virgil? Um, Maybe not, but anyway, Virgil in the Divine Comedy, right? The Inferno. Virgil basically takes Dante on a tour of hell. And so there it is. And I don't know what part of hell they're in, but it's not a fun part. Hell isn't supposed to be fun anyway. So yeah, and that's 14th century. That's the medieval period. So you're looking at this harkening, and of course they do that with opera plots. A lot of the opera plots are taken from medieval history, uh, especially Wagner. Yeah, Wagner loves the Middle Ages. Lohengrin, The Search for the Holy Grail, and Parsifal, which is a sequel to Lohengrin. Um, Tannhäuser. Even The Ring is the whole Ring is part of this sort of early Middle Ages. It takes place kind of in the Dark Ages, and so we get uh, this emphasis on the Middle Ages. And architects are not outdone. These are painters. Uh, here's Turner, and that this signifies right this return to nature, this idea of a sunset. Turner paints a sunset, and there's always a sense of kind of this particular painting. There's a sense of calm here. You know, the ships are still. They're calm. Even this steamship is not going very fast, and the water is smooth and calm, and the sunset is beautiful. That's not true of all of Turner's paintings. Sometimes there's a lot of action in his paintings, but you notice the use of color here, the use of bright colors and how they change according to the way the light strikes them, and um, you know, uh, the emotional effect of that painting is just fabulous. Turner was an English painter who was painting landscapes like this for most of his career. Um, and, you know, we get that in the United States too. A lot of landscape painters in the 19th century in the United States. I can't remember offhand uh, the one that's so famous. I think he was a Swiss painter, and he was one of the first people to paint Yellowstone. Um, Wonderful stuff, and Yosemite. The architects are not outdone. Um, Neo-Gothic architecture is really big in this period, and here you see the Houses of Parliament, Westminster. Um, the building that the old Westminster was falling down, so they tore it down, and in the middle of the 19th century they built this thing, and you notice it's got Gothic spires and a Gothic tower and Big Ben, the clock. It's very much in neo-Gothic architecture, and that's really typical of English architecture in this during this period. If you've seen Downton Abbey, the mansion that the count lives in Downton Abbey is the Carnarvon mansion, and that mansion was remodeled by the same architect who built uh, the Houses of Parliament. Okay, so it's another neo-Gothic building, and of course it's the star of the series. You know, so the movie is out. So, you know, so you can see the building again. Um, and it's the star. It really upstages everyone else except for Maggie Smith. It's hard to upstage her. And right, gables and turrets. There's a house like this down on Main Street, you know, in South Main, on the other side of the railroad tracks. One of the first houses built in Midland, and it looks like a lot like this. You know, this Victorian architecture, really popular in the United States, and so we see houses like this all over the country. Uh, Sears sold them as modules. You could order one from Chicago and then bring it out on the train and with instructions for assembling it. I kid you not. So, as I said before, Beethoven, in a lot of ways, anticipates Romanticism simply because Beethoven is free to basically express his personal, what is it, his personal existential problems and conflicts in the music. The music, you know, his instrumental music is still basically absolute music, but you can hear the conflicts going on in Beethoven. And we discussed this. You know, I'm going deaf. You know, Napoleon's army is besieging us. You know, I'm locked in here. I can't hear the bombs going off, but I know they're going off. Um, you know, you can imagine the anxiety that And so da 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 da, and he's expressing that. And boy, do you see that in Romantic music. Tchaikovsky is literally comes out of the closet in his Sixth Symphony. Um, and so he, God knows if he'd come out of the closet really and said that he was gay, he would have been killed or imprisoned or both. Um, but he could come out of the closet in his music and say, "This is who I am, and it's beautiful." Um, so yeah, Tchaikovsky is coming out of the closet. He's just doing it in a symphony, and so yeah, Berlioz is crazy. Okay, he's got a terrible, terrible attachment problem, and he puts it all into the Symphonie Fantastique. I'm in love with an Irish actress who doesn't speak French, and I don't speak English, but I love her anyway, and I'm stalking her. And here's what this is about, da dee da dee da dee da dee da. So yeah, this is Berlioz's way of telling us that he's got problems, and the problems. So um, yeah, the symmetrical melody of Viennese classical music is we get these expansive singing melodies. Da da dee da dee da dee da dee da dee da dee da dee. Perfect example of a romantic melody. It's called the Idée fixe. So we'll talk about it when we get to the Symphonie Fantastique by Berlioz. Um, Rhythmic clarity, right? On 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1. Rhythmic diversity in the 19th century, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 4, 5. 5, 4. Okay. Yes, it's the Sixth Symphony by Tchaikovsky, and there it is. He writes an entire movement in 5. Okay. Chromaticism comes back. We'd seen it in the Baroque period, and now it's back. It's less diatonic, more. Boy, you talk about chromaticism. Wagner really it blows up the ship here with chromaticism. He doesn't stay in the same key for more than a couple of bars. He's off into another key. Right. So 3 notes and then the modulation. That's Wagner. Um, you know, more polyphonic texture. We're going to hear that with Berlioz in the last movement, where he writes an entire fugue as the end of this final movement of the Symphonie Fantastique. So we have plenty of homophonic texture, but not as much as before in the Viennese period. The audience, of course, for Mozart and Haydn are the aristocrats, the patrons. No more patronage system. Instead, what we're doing is we're going to market this music to public theaters and to this large middle class. The Industrial Revolution creates a middle class. In French, they call them the bourgeoisie. And this middle class is really, they're the people, there are lots of them, and they have money. And they don't have as much money as the old aristocrats did, but they've got money. So we're going to market these concerts to them, and we hope to fill up the concert hall or the opera house with these middle class people. And so you have a lot less in terms of patrons and a lot more in terms of marketing. And this changes the entire structure of the music. How do you attract middle class people to come to concerts and hear this? Um, yeah. So the houses, the concert houses and the opera houses have to get bigger because we need to basically bring these people in and have them buy tickets, and we need to sell a lot of tickets to basically keep this whole enterprise going. So how do we market these things to this middle class audience? And we'll see the marketing plans here with the subject matter of these people. Um, the science of the craft of orchestration changes the way the orchestra is used. Uh, we get this more uniform timbre where the strings play most of the time, and you have trumpets and woodwinds used as color. Um, that doesn't happen here. All of a sudden, the brass takes over, and the brass just basically takes over the orchestra and dominates it to a much greater extent than had happened before. The orchestra, Beethoven started this ball rolling to larger orchestras, and all of a sudden, the orchestra becomes a monster, 110, 120 players. Even in the operas, you get between 60 to 80 to 120 players in the pit, and God help the singers, because the singers have their voices haven't changed; they still have the same puny um, vocal anatomy that they had before. But how are you going to be heard over this monster orchestra? Well, yeah. And it's constantly changing, So the Berlioz literally created this craft of orchestration and used the orchestra brilliantly in the Symphonie Fantastique. And every composer following Berlioz has done the same thing, the same way. Use these instruments in all kinds of different ways to create a huge number of sound colors. So orchestration is literally born in this period. There's a little improvisation in the Viennese classical period. A cadenza in a concerto can be improvised. No, that's gone. The composer is king. You will do what the composer tells you to do, and the composer in the 19th century gives you detailed instructions. Sometimes they're in German, so you better learn a little German. But they're there and they're detailed. You better follow them, or else. I don't know what else. But anyway. Yeah. And so, okay, the Romantic writers exhibit this idea of bizarre and macabre better than even the composers. But we are marketing this music and of course novels and everything else. We're marketing these things to a middle class audience. So we don't have the emotional reserve that the Viennese classical people had. No, we want to emphasize the bizarre, the macabre. The horror story is born in the 19th century. They don't tell horror stories in late 18th century at all. That's just not something that those patrons, those aristocrats would identify with. But boy, do horror stories sell in the 19th century. And remember, we're trying to attract a middle class audience. So yeah, horror stories are great. So yeah, we get all kinds of romantic literature that Heine was the great poet of the 19th century in Germany. Victor Hugo. Uh, yeah, there are a number of operas that are basically just taken. The plot for La Traviata by Verdi is from Victor Hugo's novel La Dame aux Camélias, and on and on and on. Byron, Shelley, Keats, these English poets and writers specialize in all kinds of interesting ideas, especially bizarre and macabre, um, as we'll see. Uh, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, Alexandre Dumas, uh, Dumas, The Three Musketeers, Count of Monte Cristo, great novels. And Mary Shelley, they had a contest. I think it was in Italy. Shelley and Byron and her husband and Keats, I believe, were all there. And they had a contest to see who could write the scariest story. And Mary Shelley won. She doesn't look like she could write a scary story, but she won and she created Frankenstein. America was not to be outdone in the creation of horror. Washington Irving, uh, the, uh, the legend of Sleepy Hollow, the Headless Horseman. All of these things come from the sick mind of Washington Irving. he was kind of the ancestor of Stephen King, of course, and along with Edgar Allan Poe. Uh, and yeah, uh, artists become bohemians. They become rebels against society. There you see the young Tolstoy and the Bronte sisters. The Bronte, what was it? Emily Bronte, who published Wuthering Heights as a man. Uh, she couldn't get published as a woman, so she basically stuck a man's name on the novel, and it sold like hotcakes. And finally, I don't know, after several years, she said, "Yeah, I wrote it. It's mine." And so, yeah, and this is true of female authors in France and in America as well. We get women writing as women; they have to change their name to a man's name. George Sand in France even went so far as to wear men's clothing and smoke cigars when she visited her publisher because she didn't want anybody to know she was a woman. Um, it goes on like that. So yeah, there you see Frankenstein, strangeness, wonder, the monster that terrorized the world. Edgar Allan Poe, The Raven, the Fall of the House of Usher, on and on and on. Poe is a sad, sad character, an alcoholic who is dying of tuberculosis, and yet he composes these incredible books. He tried to go to West Point, and they kicked him out of West Point. Thank God. So he turned to writing scary stories. And yeah, thank God he was thrown out. Also, the Industrial Revolution plays a role in the music. Um, you know, in the year 1800, valves are created, so trumpets and French horns can now play chromatic scales with a lot more facility than they could before. So they create these improvements. And of course, the piano is steadily improved over the 19th century. So by the end of the 19th century, you get your familiar Steinway piano that everybody uses today. But uh, that wasn't the piano of 1800, the century before. So they make these improvements in these pianos. Metal strings take the place of gut strings. Um, and there are various improvements in the soundboard and in the mechanism of the keys, and they greatly increase the sustaining power of the piano. So the piano of 1900 is a very different instrument from the piano that existed 100 years before. Um, and and of course, I talked about this before. We're trying to attract a crowd to come to a concert now. And how do you attract a crowd? Well, that's what do you want to do? Well, controversy sells, so we try to make it controversial. And people come to this sounds controversial. That's a marketing plan that's still used today. Have you noticed that? Every time a new movie comes out, they try to create a controversy around it. And you go to the movie and you're wondering what the beef is, or sometimes the movie isn't that good anyway. But yeah, they always try to create controversy, and that's true here as well. So, and of course, the orchestra gets huge. You see what, two harps? There's some pieces that require six harps. I kid you not. Um, and if you got four trombones, you better have 21st violins. So you've got to balance this out. So the craft of orchestration is born, and the orchestra grows. I don't know how many people are there. You don't have to count them. There are over 100 people there um, on that stage, playing this music. It ain't cheap. You got to pay these people. So not only does the orchestra grow in size, but the expense incurred grows as well. Uh, and this creates kind of a treadmill effect where, the artist, the composer, has to make the music more bizarre, more confrontational, uh, more, he's got to market this because you need a bigger and bigger audience. And so we're going to create a lot more, kind of controversy around this music. to market it. So the music becomes increasingly expressive. It's almost melodramatic. Okay, these emotions, instead of, we saw that in the Baroque. You concentrate on one emotion. Well, in the Romantic period, you concentrate on half a dozen emotions at least, and you go from one to the next rapidly. And so you go from despair to joy to back to despair uh, endlessly. And so there's this constant shifting of emotions. And they use the orchestra to create that, and they change keys more frequently, and it just goes on and on like that. It makes the music very interesting. The use of folklore and myth in music is huge. Um, so the story of the Rusalka, or this uh, you know myths of you know the the Nibelungs. The Nibelungenlied from the Middle Ages is a series of myths about these dwarfs that mint gold. And that's you see these myths in Wagner operas and elsewhere as well. So folklore plays a role in nationalism as well. So these local stories, folklores of the Earl King, this ghost that lives in the woods and steals children. Exoticism, the Pearl Fishers by Bizet takes place in India, so it's this exotic location. No one had been to India at the time, in France. And so they create this world of India, without knowing what it is, but nevertheless, it takes place in India. So we have a sense of the exotic in a lot of this music. Um, we've been through this, haven't we? Um, yeah, expanded forms. We get um, So instead of just the four movement symphony that we had in the Viennese classical period, we get the program symphony, the choral symphony, the symphonic poem. These are all compositions written for symphonies that kind of expand that whole idea. Of course, Beethoven's Ninth Symphony is a choral symphony. He adds a chorus and soloists in the last movement, and we see Mendelssohn doing the same thing, and then Mahler doing the same thing later on. So they write these choral symphonies. Program symphony is a symphony that tells a story, and we're going to see that with uh, Symphonie Fantastique. There's a whole story, a program that tells you the story, and he tells you that story in the program in the music. A symphonic poem. The Moldau is a good example of that, where he tells a story of this river in Bohemia as it moves from the Carpathian Mountains south into and flows into the Elbe River on the border of Bohemia and Moravia. So we're going to hear that. So these things all kind of you've got to have a program in the 19th century. The music has to tell a story, whether you want to tell the story or not, or whether the story is a story you're not really telling. Uh, you're telling another story, but you can't tell that story in public, so you have to tell another story. Yeah. So, but it has to have a story. You've got to have a program. So that's all a huge part of Romanticism. In the 18th century, you had absolute music, especially during Haydn and Mozart. They're writing absolute music. They don't have to tell a story because they're writing for a patron who doesn't expect one. But now you're writing for a different audience. You're writing for a middle class audience who want a story. They want the music to tell you a story so they can try to figure out what's going on. And so you tell them a story. Doesn't have to be a true story. Doesn't even have to be the story you want to tell. So the public concert hall is the venue now. The public opera house, the public concert house hall. This is where the money's being made. And to that end, there is even more emphasis on a star system. We see touring professionals not just in the opera world where they had existed since the 17th century, but also in the world of these spectacular instrumental performers. Clara Schumann at the piano, uh, Paganini, the violinist, who was rumored to have sold his soul to the devil. So he named his violin Il Diablo, the devil. Um, Liszt, who invented the shtick of swooning from the piano. He played so expressively that he fainted. What a what a shtick! He invented this shtick. James Brown later did it, and so did Springsteen. Okay, but they took their cue from Liszt, who made it uh, de rigueur, to swoon, to faint at the piano, and it drove women crazy. Um, yeah. Okay. So also you have, right, love children being born as a result of this star system. Um, you know, just like today's rock stars, it's the same story. So yeah, so we get this star system. The solo performer is everything, and and musicians increasingly become educators. You've got to make a living. You can't make an entire acceptable living writing music for public performance. So you have to basically teach as well, and so musicians become teachers, and there's still an active publishing uh, deal, so musicians can earn copyright fees by publishing. So all of these things help musicians make a living. It's never been an easy living for anybody, but here they're doing it. Um, and women uh, really kind of um, are more visible here in the 19th century. Part of it's due to the fact that there are no more castrati. So women like Lottie Lehman and Jenny Lind and others, take the stage, and so you see more and more female voices being heard. You don't have these castrati anymore, these male sopranos and altos. So women have to basically adopt those roles. So you see a lot more women on the stage than you did in the 18th century. And also you see women composers. Clara Schumann was a brilliant pianist. Uh, she and Robert collaborated on a lot of music, and a lot of it was probably written by her. So we're going to hear an example of a piece by Clara Schumann as we go through. Fanny Mendelssohn, uh, uh, Mendelssohn's sister rather, was famous as a composer as well. Um, the 19th century saw a lot of publishing activity in these small kinds of parlor pieces. This is kind of parlor music. With the Industrial Revolution comes the growth of a middle class, accountants, clerks, um, various other kinds of people, begin to get a little bit more income, and they live in, large homes in these towns. And one of the first things that you do as a middle class person in the 19th century is buy a piano. Uh, you have enough money to afford a piano, so you buy one. Well, so you've got a piano, somebody has to play it. So you teach your children how to play the piano. You may learn to play the piano yourself. And then you need to get music to play. So there's a lot of publishing in terms of these small sort of parlor pieces for voice and piano or for solo piano. And composers can earn money by having the rights to a lot of these published songs or piano pieces. So we see a lot of this song literature. In Germany, this word for song is Lied, Lied. And so we call this body of work often, it's often called German Lieder. Um, and yeah, the songs can be strophic, just one verse after another after another. Schubert wrote hundreds of songs like that. Some songs are through composed; they don't really follow any kind of set pattern, or modified strophic. John Dowland's lute song is a good example of that. So there's nothing new about any of this. Um, but yeah, we've got this body of song literature, and that happens in the United States as well. You know, with people like Stephen Foster, who published all of those songs. And again, it's parlor music for middle class people. Um, so this is different though from the old patronage system in the preceding century, where you didn't really see any of this because there wasn't really much of a middle class. Now there is, and so you get uh, these romantic songs published, and there are hundreds and hundreds of these things, books and books of published songs from the 19th century in French, in German, uh, yeah, yeah, and they're still performed today. They're wonderful. So if you're going to write a song, you need a poet to write the words, and so we get a lot of these composers like Schubert, Schumann, Brahms. They set music by various poets. Schubert and Schumann concentrated on the better ones. You know, Rückert, Goethe, Heine. Um, Brahms didn't set good poets very much. He said they didn't need his help, so he set mostly doggerel kinds of poetry. Although Schubert, set the poetry of Miller, and Miller wasn't much of a poet either. But yeah, Goethe and Heine were two really fine examples of great poets from this period. And so, and we're going to hear an example by Goethe here uh, from your uh, from your listening guides. Okay, so we're going to discuss Schubert and the German Lieder. Schubert was a prolific composer, not just of songs. He composed some 700 or 800 songs during his lifetime. He uh, he was kind of a little bit like Mozart. He was a Wunderkind who began composing at a very young age. In fact, the Earl King that we're going to listen to was written when he was 17 or 18. So, and it's truly a work of genius. Um, but he also wrote symphonies, chamber musics. He wrote some incredibly glorious chamber music. Um, and and so he's a prolific composer. He was a bit of a hermit because his health was never that good. So he was not a self promoter. He's a great admirer of Beethoven, and he was a little bit younger than Beethoven. He's kind of a generation removed from Beethoven, but certainly he was uh, he was a great admirer of Beethoven. Never met him. It wouldn't have done him any good anyway because Beethoven was deaf. But um, so he only lived to be about 30 years old. But so he wrote quite a bit of music in the 30 years he had. Um, so yeah, lots of wonderful piano sonatas that are still played, and the symphonies, great symphonies. Especially, the unfinished symphony is done all the time. It's not really unfinished, but it's just doesn't have the four movement structure that you expect from this period, and so they call it the unfinished symphony. But we're going to listen to a masterpiece song written by Schubert, Karl the Erlkönig, or the Earl King. And your listening guide is on page 170 of your textbook. So take a look at the Earl King and uh, listen to the song. So there is an artist rendition of the Earl King. He's a pretty sinister character. Um, and the song, as you see, there's a translation on page 170 and 171. It's a dialogue between a father and his son and the Earl King. And the father, he's riding through the woods and he notices that his son is very upset and he can't understand why. And his son, well, Daddy, don't you see the Earl King over there? And the father says, No, I don't see a thing. It's just, a streak of mist. And then the Earl King talks to the kid, Oh, my dear boy, come with me. And that continues. The child grows more and more afraid and anxious because he sees the Earl King's daughters. He sees, he sees these visions. And all the father sees is, the sun shining in the wood, on a field, or, the wind blowing dry leaves around. Um, so the father and the son see two different worlds. And, um, and the Earl King keeps talking to the kid, and finally he grabs him. And the kid whines, "Daddy, the Earl King's got me." And so when the father finally reaches their house, he notices that his son has died. Well, okay, this is a sad song. It's not really about a kid dying, though. It's about something bigger dying. It's about the death of wonder. you know, it's about the death of something bigger than us. It's about the death of faith. Um, and so Goethe is really, I think, in a way, criticizing the Enlightenment and criticizing the Industrial Revolution, um, because in the Industrial Revolution everything becomes a commodity, including people, um, especially during this period in the United States. So we commoditize everything in the Industrial Revolution. Everything has a price. Everything is a transaction. Um, and Goethe is not impressed by that. So this poem is really about the commodification of the world. So all we see is something to be exploited, um, and the magic is gone. The thrill is gone, in the words of B.B. King. So that's what's happening here, I think. And you can interpret this poem the way you want, but that's how I interpret it. And it's a masterful setting of the poem because you hear the piano with that triplet figure, that triplet figure in the piano, and you can hear that the horse kind of trotting along. Um, and and then over that you have this dialogue. And so when the Earl King speaks, right, he changes key from minor to major, and but there's still that constant pounding triplet figure in the left hand of the piano. Not an easy piece for a pianist, and pianists often dread this piece. uh, but it's a great masterpiece. So listen to it and uh, think about think about the poetry and what it represents, and how that Schubert basically uh, enhances that text with this wonderful musical arrangement. So let's see, you've got the story of the Schumanns on page 172, and you've got a couple of examples. One from Robert, the piece from the Dichter Liebe, um, im wunderschönen Monat Mai, and then the Liebste Schönheit by Clara. This is quite a love story, um, and it really happened. It's not like your romance novel thing. Um, Clara was a child prodigy and became a concert pianist. Her maiden name was Wieck, and she was from the city of Leipzig. And her father, Edvard Wieck, was a musician and taught music. Um, and he wanted the best for his daughter, and he realized that musicians don't have the ability to make a lot of money, especially female musicians. If they want to have a family, they can't be running around concertizing. That's not good. So he wanted her to marry a wealthy banker, somebody like that. Well, a young guy comes to study music with Edvard in their home. His name was Robert Schumann. And Schumann and Clara fell madly in love with each other. They just hit it off. And, Wieck tried to pry them apart, but he couldn't. So he opposed this relationship, and he became more and more opposed to their love as time went on. Um, and there eventually was a lawsuit. Edvard's wife divorced him over this. I mean, it was a big mess. And Clara, when she turned 18, she went straight to Robert and they got married. They had 5 children. Um, and they collaborated on these compositions. It's hard. A lot of people now say that she was responsible for composing a lot of them herself. The piano concerto in A minor, for instance, a lot of people at first credited it to Robert, but now it belongs to Clara. Okay, so and so yeah, music scholars go back and forth on this, but there's a collaboration here, and with a lot of Robert's songs, you can see the touch of Clara in the preludes and postludes of the songs. So yeah, and Robert they published a large body of work similar to Schubert in a way. There are symphonies, there are concertos, the piano concerto, then a cello concerto. There are um, there's a lot of chamber music, string quartets, and various other kinds of chamber music, and also these Lieder. And again, Schumann was a prolific Lieder composer, and they're wonderful songs. So yeah, sadly, when Schumann was about 40, 45 years old, I believe, he succumbed to mental illness. He tried to commit suicide and died in a mental hospital. Uh, he evidently he had to stop composing because in his mind he kept hearing the G. So this note kept interrupting him, and he couldn't. It got to be so loud in his head that he couldn't compose. It was I'm not sure what that is. I'm not an expert in these things, but one of the last compositions he wrote was this cello concerto, and it has to be in G, and it features a droning G throughout the concerto because he said, well, I might if I'm hearing this thing, I might as well write it down. Um, and so that's kind of the last thing he was able to write, and he died in a mental hospital, um, which was no picnic in the 19th century, trust me. But he did leave us this wonderful body of work, and uh, yeah, one of the most popular of his song cycles. All right. As I said before, Schumann, in his brief life, was composed um, a very large amount of music. And it's interesting, he basically composed one genre at a time. So he started out with piano music, then he wrote Lieder, then he turned to chamber music, then he composed symphonies and concertos. So, so he basically tackled one thing at a time as a composer. So it's kind of interesting to examine these works, and a number of them, especially the piano concerto in A minor, were collaborative efforts between him and Clara. I may have said this before, but Schumann suffered from mental illness. Towards the end of his life, he couldn't compose anymore because he kept hearing this note G in his head. This G stuck there. So the last composition he wrote was a cello concerto in G, with a droning G that comes back throughout the work. So yeah, uh, we're going to hear, of course, these examples of Schumann's Lieder with Im wunderschönen Monat Mai. So listen. Dichterliebe. Dichterliebe means the love of a poet. And this is unrequited love. The poet's in love, but he's not loved in return. So he's sad. And you'll notice as you listen to 19th century music that a lot of the music is really sad. They love to wallow in sadness, and they express it better than perhaps any of their predecessors. Now we've seen that before. We've seen the the death scene from Dido and Aeneas, uh, where Dido is dying, and so we have that that descending chromatic uh, ground bass that basically takes us down and down and down. So, but that's just one of the 9 affections in the Baroque period. Here it's almost as though it's the only affection here. So the Im wunderschönen Monat Mai begins with a wonderful piano prelude that is very plaintive, very sad. It's the wonderful month of May, but I don't feel wonderful. Um, it kind of takes me back to the 1950s when there was a popular song called I'm Just a Teenager in Love. And I guess you could say the Dichterliebe is kind of the same thing. I'm just a poet in love. Notice that this song is strophic. So, and there's a lot of rubato, slowing down and speeding up. It's strophic. And when we get to mein Sehnen und Verlangen, my desire and longing, you can kind of hear that as the tenor sings this thing. Oh, by the way, it's a tenor. It's not a baritone. I don't know why they say it's a baritone, but they're wrong. Another one of those textbook typos that you get so much. They can't spell Rückert. They mistake a tenor for a baritone. I don't know how you can do that, but there it is. So enjoy Im wunderschönen Monat Mai. And the second track there is just the second verse of this song. And the song doesn't end because it goes straight into the next song. It's attached to the next song directly, the way the third movement of the Fifth Symphony is attached to the fourth movement. So, yeah. And then I told her of my desire and longing, and she said, "Get lost." Oh, yeah, right. So that's the poet's sad song here, and it just gets sadder as it goes through this song cycle. Liebst du Schönheit? This is by Clara. There you see Robert and Clara. Clara at the piano. She toured as a concert pianist throughout her life. And she became a close friend of Johannes Brahms. Brahms spent a lot of time with the Schumanns in Leipzig before he ended up in Vienna. So, and they were very close friends throughout their life. But Liebst um Schönheit is a wonderful poem, and it's strophic mostly, homophonic texture. This time you get a female soprano with piano accompaniment, and the poet is Rückert, and Rückert is misspelled. It should be spelled Ruckert, but so another mistake here in your textbook. But yeah, listen to this wonderful poem. Uh, the poem here is set by Clara, but also there's another version of it, sort of a cover, I guess you would say, set by Mahler later on. So a generation or two after Clara, Gustav Mahler came up. I love this poem so much that he said it as well. Um, so it's an important setting of that. So we're talking about these short pieces that are basically parlor music, and we have some of this parlor music set uh, for just solo piano as well. So as your children are learning to play the piano, realize there are no video games, no television, none of the distractions that we have today, no cell phones. So what does a kid do? Well, you can only run and play for so long. Then you come in and you practice piano a little bit, and you get interested in the piano, and you begin to play better and better and better. And so you get to the point where you're really good, and you can play Chopin and Liszt. And Chopin and Liszt require hours and hours of practice every day. You just it's really a lot of work to get these pieces up and running for the most part. So, but then again, a lot of these kids in middle class families, they had a lot of time on their hands. So what are you going to do? Sit down at the piano, and that's what they do, and they get really good, and they buy these, books of piano solo music, uh, and they just start playing. And so, uh, and composers supplied music to these middle class families just for solo piano. Schubert, wrote sonatas, composed these piano sonatas. Chopin then came along in the next generation and supplied all kinds of solo piano music, a lot of Polish dance music, and Liszt as well. Liszt wrote these pieces for himself to play, and then dared anyone else to try. And a lot of them took up the dare. Chopin, there's George Sand, the female novelist who dressed like a man so she could publish. And Chopin and Sand had a brief affair. Um, and yeah, Chopin was born in Poland, immigrated from Poland to Paris as a young man after he went to music school in Warsaw, and began writing mostly these short piano pieces. Chopin contracted tuberculosis, and he's slowly dying of tuberculosis. And I think it explains quite a bit, a lot of his music, because the music is always sad. Yeah. It's like, I'm dying, here, listen. And so so it's just one sad song after another, after another, after another. And it's glorious, gloriously sad. If you're a lovesick adolescent, this is the music for you. Um, and but it appeals to me even at my age. I won't tell you how old I am. But so Chopin, even he did write a couple of piano concertos, but he's mainly known for these small piano works, mazurkas, polonaise, nocturnes. These are the kinds of things that that he does. Uh, so uh, so the Nocturne Opus 9, number 2, is on page 178 and 179. It's about a 3 or 4 minute long piece, and it's in 12/8. So it's 1 and 2 and 3 and 4, and 12/8 is 4, but each beat is subdivided into 3. He's 20 years old when he composed this thing, and it's a night piece, so it's very reflective and gentle. It's all solo piano. It's not really in any kind of form. Just it's like the Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata, the first movement. It's just kind of this theme that keeps coming back, and then you have a contrasting theme and even a third contrasting theme. Um, but it's pretty much typical Chopin. Um, so listen and enjoy. Liszt, Franz Liszt was born in Hungary and was a touring professional pianist. As I said before, he invented the shtick of fainting, playing so expressively at the piano that he lost consciousness and fainted and fell on the floor. And that's been exploited by people like James Brown and Bruce Springsteen. I don't know if they read about Liszt and decided, hey, I think I'll try that. But nevertheless, that's what that's what they do. You hear a lot with Chopin and Liszt in particular with his solo piano music. You hear a lot of tempo rubato. Uh, rubato means robbed. In essence, what the music does is speed up and slow down, speed up and slow down, and it adds this expressive kind of emotional effect. Uh, it adds a melodramatic emotional effect really to the music, and this is and so it makes it's a way of increasing the expressiveness of the piece. So when you listen to this transcendental etude, it's written really for Liszt to play, and it's really flashy. Lots of arpeggios, lots of fast scales, um, and so it's kind of a show-off piece, but it's also just a wonderful piece of music. And you'll notice that this is in sonata form. This is our old friend. By now, you should be well versed in sonata form. There are 3 themes in the exposition. There's a brief development and a recapitulation, and a coda. So this this tells you a lot about what's going on here. Okay, now we're going to get into the meat of 19th century orchestral music. And unlike this Viennese classical music, where all the orchestral music and instrumental music is abstract music, it doesn't tell a story. Uh, a lot of composers in the 19th century throw that out. After all, they've got to market this stuff to a middle class audience, and they've got to put put people in seats to hear this music. So they have to come up with a marketing plan. And the marketing plan here is fairly simple. Write music that tells a story and tell a story that appeals to this middle class, upper middle class audience. That's the deal. Get people coming to sit in seats to watch. And it's pretty much the same today, isn't it? So there's a marketing plan. We can begin a concert with a concert overture that tells the story. Say, what about, let's tell the story of Romeo and Juliet. uh, and it goes on and on. So concert overtures. Let's tell the story of Napoleon's invasion of Russia in 1812. Um, and so the audience is treated to this nationalistic flag waving Russian story about the defeat of Napoleon in 1812. Um, a lot of times they'll compose incidental music for plays. Mendelssohn's Midsummer Night's Dream is an incidental music for the play by Shakespeare, and it's been used for many, many decades as a result as incidental music in the play. I heard it one time myself. A programmed symphony. This is a symphony that tells a story. And we're going to, with Berlioz and Symphonie Fantastique, we're going to basically hear the story that Berlioz is telling. And it's autobiography. And yes, Berlioz is crazy. Um, and so it's a kind of an insane story about an insane guy who, well, I don't know, he might be qualified as a borderline personality, uh, although that terminology may be obsolete even as we speak. So yeah, but trust me, Berlioz is not playing with a full deck. But boy, can he express it in music. And the symphonic poem, we're going to have an example of that with Smetana's Moldau. Um, this is just an orchestral piece that tells some sort of story, has a program. With the Moldau, it's a story of this river that runs through Bohemia um, and into Prague. And then, of course, when the river gets to Prague, you hear a national hymn, hooray for Bohemia, Moravia, and the Czech culture, et cetera, et cetera. So, yeah, program music is the rage. Even if you don't want to print a program, you have to, unless you're Brahms or Dvorak. Those two guys didn't have to do that. So Brahms basically sticks to absolute music, but Brahms could get away with it when other composers couldn't or wouldn't, because a lot of composers, they want to tell a story. So here's the story. So a lot of this music is program music, and it stems from opera. Opera becomes more melodramatic, uh, even bigger than it was in the 18th century, and more appealing to a middle class audience. So that audience begins to expect a story when they walk into a concert hall, just like they expect a good story when they walk into the opera house. So give them what they want because they're going to pay. So there you see Hector Berlioz, a French composer in the early 19th century. And you've got a little biographical sketch of Berlioz on page 184 of your textbook. Berlioz is an interesting guy. He couldn't play anything. He couldn't play a musical instrument. So, but he had this incredible imagination when it came to the use of the orchestra. And so that kind of worked in his favor a little bit, believe it or not. he could use these instruments in different ways, ways that nobody had thought of before. And this Symphonie Fantastique that you're going to listen to is a good example of that. And we'll talk about some of the stuff that he's doing. It's amazing what he's actually doing here. And it's, in fact, it's probably one of the, top 10 most creative pieces ever written uh, for anything in music. It's incredibly brilliant and creative. Um, well, the story of the symphony is really about, guess what? Unrequited love. Here he is. Berlioz is just a teenager in love, although he should have known better because he wasn't a teenager anymore. But he saw a performance of Hamlet, and the Ophelia was a red-headed Irish actress. She was quite stunning. Named Her name was Harriet Smithson, and Smithson couldn't speak French. Berlioz couldn't speak English. But nevertheless, Berlioz fell madly in love with Harriet Smithson, and he began, well, I'm sorry. Sounds to me like he was stalking her. Okay. So take that for whatever it's worth. She couldn't get rid of him. She was like gum on her shoe, uh, the harder she tried, the more she saw of him, and she was getting, a little bit. I imagine she was a little bit scared. Um, at one point, at one point, uh, Berlioz left Paris and went to Rome, and he was actually in the process of writing the Symphonie Fantastique. He finished it up in Rome, and when he was in Rome, he got word that Harriet intended to marry a banker. Well, what actress wouldn't marry a banker? I mean, it's a really good career move. um, and he became so upset that he decided to kill the banker and Harriet and himself. So we're going to have a murder suicide. Fortunately for Berlioz and for all of us, because Berlioz went on to compose some fantastic music. Fortunately, we're in the days of single shot black powder pistols. Um, I think they were still flintlock at the time. Okay. So anyway, Berlioz had to sneak back into France with loaded pistols. So how do you do that? Well, you disguise yourself as a woman. So Berlioz put on a dress, disguised himself as a woman, and got on a boat bound for Nice, I guess. And the boat foundered offshore of France, and so when he waded ashore, uh, his powder was wet, so his pistols were useless. He was himself was going to take a massive dose of laudanum. Uh, Laudanum is morphine drops in fruit juice. So he had like a jar full of laudanum he was going to drink after shooting them both. Well, the pistols were useless. Uh, I don't know what he did with the laudanum, but he went back to France or went back to Rome, tidied up the score, sent it to the publisher, and Harriet got wind of this. She said, "He's written a symphony about me." Wow. So, man, yeah, she was very impressed. So they got married. Bad idea. They couldn't communicate. It was not much of a marriage. Um, and but nevertheless, Berlioz went on to compose a huge array of wonderful orchestral and vocal music. Les Nuits d'été, The Nights of Summer, the settings of poems by Théophile Gautier. Just a wonderful song cycle with orchestral accompaniment. Uh, uh, the Les Troyens, the story of the siege of Troy in music, fantastic piece of music, and this stuff is well worth listening to. But the most popular thing that he wrote is Symphonie Fantastique, the Fantastic Symphony. Um, kind of an interesting marketing plan. Yeah, you want to sell tickets, call it a Fantastic Symphony, but it better be fantastic. Well, it is. It lives up to the billing, believe it or not. There is Harriet, a daguerreotype photograph of Harriet Smithson. And I think she was even more striking. if you saw her in person, that hair is just flaming red. She was Irish, and she was quite an actress, and had a brief career before she had to take care of her mother and left the stage. But by that time, she and Berlioz were married. They became estranged, and yeah, didn't work out. Oh darn. Okay. So, what's this about? Well, you've got the program here on page 184, 185 of the symphony, and just like Beethoven back, with the Symphony Number 5 in C minor with that da 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 da. Uh, we have also this unifying feature in this symphony. It's called the Idee Fix, and it goes dee dee da dee da 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 dee da dee ba da bum, and it symbolizes, of course, the love that this poet feels for this woman. It's unrequited love, and so the poet decides to kill himself with a large dose of opium. Sound familiar? And it doesn't work. It doesn't kill him, but it gives him these visions and dreams. And it's a five movement symphony. The first movement is reveries and passions, and so we see this ideal state of this artist as he's conjuring up visions of his beloved, and we hear this Idee Fix melody coming in just beautiful in the high strings. The violins play it, and so we get this romantic fixation that this. I think the best translation of Idee Fix is obsession. If you look it up in the dictionary, you'll see it. um, Literally in French, it means fixed idea. Well, that doesn't make any sense, but obsession does. And I think, uh, Berlioz is giving us this kind of feel of an obsession here. And so this guy's obsessed with this woman, and he's fixated on her. And so, it's all ideal and pretty. And then the second movement is a lovely waltz in triple meter, and yes, the Idee Fix comes in. And the third movement, you got to have a back to nature movement. This is Romanticism. So the poet goes out into the fields and is running around nature and enjoying the beauty out there. And he thinks of his beloved. And it's a very nice movement. But then in the fourth movement, the dream goes bad. He loved her, so he had to kill her. These sorts of obsessive relationships often end that way. It's very common, sadly. And so Berlioz has basically to take this to an extreme in order to keep that audience interested, and so he does a brilliant job here. He kills his beloved, and he's condemned to death. The death penalty. This is the 19th century. The death penalty is very common. So, how did they kill you? It was the guillotine. Okay, the guillotine in France was used up until the 1950s, believe it or not. And there's even a video of it. Not fun to watch. So here is this march to the scaffold, and you hear this great. I think the bassoons have it. Bum, 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 ba-da-dum, bum, ba-dum, ba-da-dum, ba-da-dum, boom, and that keeps coming back as we approach the scaffold. And of course, before the blade of the guillotine comes down, the last thing you hear is the Idee Fix, as the poet remembers his beloved, and oh, it's so beautiful, and thunk, right? The blade comes in, kind of cuts it off in the middle, and you can even hear the head hitting the basket. I kid you not. So, but that's not the end. What happens? There's a fifth movement. Well, the fifth movement is called The Dream of the Witch's Sabbath. And there you see the grotesque painting. Yes, he dies, but he doesn't go to heaven. Sorry. He goes to hell. And there's a welcoming committee in hell, and there are the witches. And the witches convene in this first part of this larghetto of the Witches' Sabbath. You'll see the listening guide on page 186. the witches are calling to one another. There's clarinet and French horn. The French horns are kind of off stage, I think, and so they're kind of calling back and forth. Together. We've got a new one. He's here. Let's welcome him. So yeah, so uh, it's a welcoming committee, and of course, at some point, the brass comes in when this guy realizes, oh God, I'm in hell. Oh no, what's going to happen to me? And yeah, so and what does happen to him? Well, the woman he murders shows up. She's down there too. What do you know? And so the tempo speeds up and becomes allegro, and we hear this very obnoxious sounding E flat clarinet. Most of the time, you hear a B flat or an A clarinet, and it has a nice mellow sound. Well, the E flat clarinet is kind of a stubbier, little shorter clarinet, and it's really kind of harsh. It's not as, piercing as an oboe, but it has a more kind of harsh tone. It's just perfect for this because the E flat clarinet plays the Idée fixe melody in this vulgar sort of 6/8 tempo. And so instead of da da dee da bee 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 dee da bee dee da bee, instead of that you get and so she's scolding him, why, if you love me, why did you kill me? I don't understand. And well, no, none of us do actually. So then at the end of this, we hear the bells tolling for the dead. Yes, you were dead. And then in part 3 of this, we hear the old medieval chant, the Dies Irae. Remember? Yeah, you probably don't, but let me reiterate it. Dies Irae, dies illa, solvet seclum in favilla, teste David cum sibilla. That's the tune. And it starts out in the tuba. Originally, they were these ophicleides, and you don't want to ever hear an ophicleide as long you don't want that sound in your head. Uh, thank God for the tuba. The tuba was invented not too long after this symphony was premiered, and the first thing they did was substitute the tuba for the ophicleide, and thank God. So, so you hear the tuba, bum 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 bum, and then and they're in the audience would have known immediately what this is. This is 19th century France. These guys are all Catholics. They've all been to funerals. They know exactly what this tune is. There's no doubt in their mind. This is the tune, Day of Anger, Day of Wrath, that day when Jesus shall return to judge the world. And so it's scary. Okay. And then we hear it played 3 or 4 times at different tempos, and it goes higher and higher. It starts out with the tubas, then we hear the trombones, and then we hear trumpets. So we have all of the brass section basically getting in on this Dies Irae. And then the woodwinds finally come in. So it gets faster and faster. And finally, we hear the witches begin to dance. And the witches dance is a magnificent, monstrous fugue, very much in the style of Bach. So we hear rum bum pa 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 pum pa pum pa pum pa 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 pa, and that's the subject of the fugue, and then it's answered just like Bach would do in that fugue in G minor that we heard earlier, and then there's, believe it or not, there's um, a wonderful episode, and then a development of the fugue. And it's during this development of the fugue that he pulls some really interesting tricks. At one point, and you'll hear it, he has the violinists turn the bow over. So instead of using the horsehair part of the bow, they turn the bow over and they play with the wooden part of the bow. And what's that? Well, it symbolizes the skeletons coming out. The skeletons show up to the party. Can't have a witches' Sabbath without a few skeletons. And so the bones of the skeletons knocked together, and that's what's happening with with playing on the wooden parts of the bow. And so you'll hear that. And then the witches' dance is combined with the Dies Irae, and all of this, explodes in this wonderful conclusion to this absolutely brilliant movement. Um, he also uses a trick where the violinists play up on the bridge, and it gives it a fuzzy kind of a sound. So this, so you hear that fuzzy sound of the playing on the bridge. You hear the more rhythmic kind of pounding sound of the bones knocking together when they play with the wooden part of the bow. It's absolutely brilliant, just brilliant. Is it? It's not totally unprecedented to have the violinists do that. There's a string quartet, I believe, where Mozart has the violinists do that. So it's not unprecedented, but it certainly is creative. Yeah, this is absolutely brilliant. So listen to the Dream of the Witch's Sabbath and enjoy. So here we are in chapter 19 of your textbook. Chapter 19 deals with 19th century nationalism. Nationalism really got its origin in the Napoleonic era. Napoleon seemed to be able to spur nationalistic movements in countries that hadn't really ever been a nation before. Germany in the north was a collection of little states ruled by local monarchs. Saxony had a king and queen. The Hohenzollerns ruled over Prussia. That's where Berlin is. And there are a number of other little German states, but none of them were really part of anything greater. That they're supposed to be part of this Holy Roman Empire, but the Holy Roman Empire didn't really exist. It only existed in people's minds. It was neither holy, nor was it Roman, nor was it an empire. Nevertheless, in the 1860s, Chancellor Bismarck, along with his monarch, the Prussian Kaiser Wilhelm I, united Germany as a country. And so by 1870, Germany was a country. They called it a Reich, which means empire. And the Kaiser was the emperor of the Reich. Um, and yeah, the rest is history. The same thing happened in the south of Europe with Italy. Italy had never been a country, and it was united in the 1860s and became the country we know today as Italy. It had not existed before 1860. So yeah, and these countries immediately began to develop an empire. After you get the United Germany, they begin taking over parts of colonies in East Africa and in the Pacific. Italy basically grabbed a hold of Libya and tried to take over Abyssinia, that's Ethiopia, and they were unsuccessful at doing that. So, yeah, and and of course, England already had an empire. It was the biggest empire that ever existed. Spain had a few remnants of an empire that had once existed. The French, of course, dominated North Africa. Tiny Belgium ruled over the Congo, and boy, is that a horrible story. So all of these countries aspire to get an empire, and so we see this competition for empire. Russia expanded to the east, all the way to the Pacific Ocean, and became the largest country in the world. So there you go. Fortunately, musical nationalism isn't as greedy and violent as those other forms of nationalism. And there are national aspirations in places other than Italy and Germany. And those national aspirations were not realized until after World War I. So think of the Czech Republic, for instance. Bohemia and Moravia is it's called, and it was a part of this Habsburg Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And this empire was occupied a large chunk of Central Europe, and the Habsburgs were not willing to let go of their power over these smaller countries. You know, Hungary, Croatia, Bosnia, Montenegro. You know, these tiny little places, and Slovakia and the Czech Republic were part of that empire. But there are people who want it to be independent. And of course, one of those people was Bedřich Smetana, the Czech composer. And to spur the national spirit of the Czech people, uh, Smetana composed a series of tone poems. A tone poem is a single movement symphonic piece that tells a story. Now, it can be any kind of story. Liszt was famous for writing all kinds of tone poems about various things. But here, Smetana, these 6 tone poems are nationalistic tone poems designed to awaken the nationalistic fervor of the Czech people. So, and the most popular of these 6 is the Moldau. The Moldau is the story of a river, and the river begins in the Carpathian Mountains, north of the Czechoslovakia or the Czech Republic, and it flows through the Czech Republic and through the city of Prague before it empties into the Elbe. Uh, so this is a perfect kind of vehicle for awakening the pride and national spirit of the Czech people. So we're going to take you through the Moldau one little bit at a time. And the listening guide is on page 191 of your textbook. So it begins with 2 little springs, a cold spring played by the flute and a hot spring played by the clarinet. The springs spark these little streams, and the streams eventually flow together to form the Moldau River. So you hear this sort of sparkling little mountain stream music played by the flute and clarinet, and gradually it grows and it increases in volume um, until you get the river. And you hear the river, this beautiful flowing theme in 6/8 meter, very conjunct melody. So that is that wonderful conjunct melody that it sounds kind of flowing along, and the river's flowing along. And so this Moldau theme, this river theme, keeps coming back, and it's like the 4-note motive in the Symphony Number 5 or the Idée fixe that we talked about with the Berlioz. It kind of unites the whole piece, by coming back again and again. Then the river flows by hunters in the forest, and the French horns come out, and you hear this forest hunt scene as right the hunters are after a stag or a fox or something, and so it's this kind of theme here of the forest hunt, and it's very charming. Yes, we have to have a peasant wedding. Now remember, in the 19th century, the peasants were the people that were closest to the soil of the land. And so there's this kind of romantic kind of, what's the word, fascination with with farmers. Okay, peasants are farmers. And so they think these people are closer to the land and they know more about what the land is than anyone else. So we get a peasant wedding, and it's a very folk song, folky kind of piece. Lots of repeated notes. Now this isn't an actual folk song. These, I don't think Smetana was all that interested in folk music. What he's interested in is portraying these peasants in a romantic way, and so we get this folk song. And So it's a kind of a, what's the word, a fake folk song. And that's not unusual in the 19th century either. So don't, yeah. But it is a peasant wedding, and then um, and uh, and so the river flows along past the peasant wedding, and then uh, twilight comes, and the river flows into the night. So we get this moonlight, and the St. John Rapids provide a nice opportunity for an orchestral climax. Timpani, brass, woodwinds, strings, they all come together to provide this sound of the water clashing against the rocks as it enters the rapids. And and so you get a climactic part of this river journey, if you will. And then about 114 into this, the river theme emerges triumphantly as the river passes out of the rapids and into this tranquil uh, lake once again. And so you get this Moldau theme, but it's triumphant. It's tutti. It's not piano anymore. It's forte. And so you really have that's also part of this climactic section. Then, as the river flows into Prague and past Vyšehrad Castle, there's the remains of the castle. Vyšehrad Castle was where the medieval monarchs were buried. They buried monarchs in churches. Okay, and if you go to Europe, you'll see monarchs' graves in various churches. Westminster Abbey is the perfect example where virtually all the monarchs, except for a couple, are buried in Westminster Abbey. Henry VIII didn't get buried there; he's buried in Windsor Castle. Richard III was under a parking lot. Okay, he wasn't one of the more popular kings, but they found him, and he was under a parking lot. So this is the place where the monarchs of medieval Bohemia were buried, and so we get a hymn, a national anthem kind of a thing. Bum 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 bum. So yeah, and then we get so this is a moment that causes these bohemian hearts to swell with pride at their once glorious past. And of course, a coda to end this tone poem as the river empties into the Elbe and then into the Danube. And uh, so it's a nice ending to this wonderful tone poem, and it's done all the time. It's really, really popular. So enjoy the Moldau. So we've got all kinds of nationalist composers now. In Norway, we have Edvard Grieg, who you see there. Finland, Sibelius, Vaughan Williams, and Benjamin Britten in England. Um, the Russians, Rimsky-Korsakov, Mussorgsky, Borodin, and to an extent Tchaikovsky, who we're going to hear in a minute. And in America, of course, we get Aaron Copland, who was an American nationalist composer. And Charles Ives, to an extent, is, and we're going to hear those composers when we get to American music. And of course, Manuel de Falla in Spain, great nationalist Spanish composer. There's Sibelius of Finland and Mussorgsky. If he looks like he's belongs under a bridge, well, that's where he died. He was a fantastic composer, but a raging alcoholic, sadly. Um, so the concert overture. This is chapter 20 in your textbook, and Beethoven actually started the ball rolling on these things. A concert overture is an overture that begins a concert, and so you'll often hear this thing done right before you hear a concerto or a symphony. So the program will be Egmont Overture by Beethoven, and then you'll have the Symphony Number 5 in C minor, Intermission Concerto Number 3, and so you've got this overture that begins something. Usually an overture begins an opera. Here it begins a concert. Um, and a number of these overtures are on Shakespearean subjects. Mendelssohn, the overture to the Midsummer Night's Dream, I think he wrote it when he was 18. Another Wunderkind. And It's a great piece. It features three themes that basically portray groups of characters. It starts off with the fairies, and then it's the I think it's the clowns, and then it's the wedding, or it's anyway. So you have these three groups of characters from the play, and uh, so Verdi's plays were translated and they were performed all over Europe during the 19th century. We've seen an example of that with Berlioz beginning to stalk Harriet Smithson as a result of seeing her in Hamlet. And that's of course sort of the downside of being an actress. You get these guys showing up out of nowhere. Uh, but so we've got other composers. Verdi turned Shakespeare plays into operas. The first attempt he made was Macbeth, and Macbeth is kind of uneven, but it follows the plot of the Shakespeare play pretty closely, but it's in Italian. Uh, he really improved on his Shakespeare when he collaborated with this librettist named Boito on Othello, and that is a really fantastic masterpiece. It's a wonderful opera. And then later on, he combined Henry IV and the Merry Wives of Windsor in Falstaff. It's the last opera that he composed, and it's again a brilliant work of genius. So Verdi turned Shakespeare plays into operas, and here we have an example of Tchaikovsky uh, and the Romeo and Juliet overture. So Tchaikovsky is Russian, and he is to an extent a nationalistic Russian composer, and um, yeah. So, and he enjoyed a distinguished career, but in fact, he had right in 1876, as you see in the biography here on page 195, he got a mysterious benefactor, a lady named Nadezhda von Meck, and she had a huge fortune, and she was impressed by the music and commissioned him to write several works and paid him a lot of money. So we see he actually had a kind of a patron. So the patron system is not completely dead here. So Nadezhda von Meck basically gave him a lot of money, um, and they never met. It was entirely by letter that she commissioned these works. Tchaikovsky attempted to marry this lady named Antonina Milyukova, and Milyukova threatened to commit suicide if he didn't marry her. So he went ahead and married her. Unfortunately, the marriage didn't last very long because, well, Tchaikovsky was gay, and and Tchaikovsky knew he was gay, and he only married her because she insisted on it. She said, "Don't worry, I can cure you." Well, don't try this at home. He, yeah. So, yeah. um, he attempted suicide then, and of course, as time grew on, he grew increasingly more depressed because being gay in Russia in the 19th century was no picnic. Uh, Gay people were harassed, they were imprisoned, they were murdered, um, and so there's no gay rights movement. There was no Stonewall riot in Russia, none of that, and that's still going on today in Russia. Um, in parts of Russia, there's still people who run around killing gay people just for fun. So it's not a great place to be gay. But wow, what a musical legacy he left us. These ballets, the Nutcracker, Swan Lake, symphonies like the Sixth Symphony, the Pathétique Symphony, which he composed right before he died, and of course these concert overture, 1812, which is done all the time, the Romeo and Juliet overture that you're going to listen to, and yeah, wonderful stuff. And it goes on and on. his operas, wonderful operas, especially Eugene Onegin, based on a poem by the famous Russian poet Pushkin. So here we have the Romeo and Juliet overture, a concert overture. And this overture is in sonata form, but it has a long introduction. Tchaikovsky isn't in a hurry. This is about about a 20-minute long piece. But it's a huge sonata allegro uh, with a long, slow introduction. And each of these themes, the introduction and the two themes in the sonata form, are connected to something going on in the play. So the introduction is the friar, and it begins very slowly. And you'll notice how the textbook takes you through this thing. It's a very hymn-like because it's a friar, but it's a Russian hymn. Sounds like Znameni chant. But you hear this Friar Lawrence theme, and you can hear it come back in the development. So that's about 5 minutes long, this long introduction. And then you get the first theme of the exposition. And you notice this is track 13, and it's the fugue theme. Bum, 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 very marcato, very much. You can hear the blades coming out and slashing as these Montagues and Capulets begin fighting. And so the fugue theme is, and we're going to hear that again in the in the development, of course. And then there's a bridge, and with this three-note idea, and the second theme begins to take hold. And the second theme is beautiful lyric writing. The Tchaikovsky is probably better at this than he is at anything. And you know, you hear this theme, da dee 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 da dee. So this theme is played time and time again. You hear it in commercials. You hear it in almost every day somewhere. And because it's such a great tune, it's very disjunct if you listen to it. The melody is very disjunct, and it changes key frequently. It's very interesting. So there's a lot of interest in this, and you get the harp basically closes out this exposition, and we begin the development. And the development basically takes the Friar Lawrence theme and uses it, and then this three-note idea, and that builds to a climax. And then the feud and Friar Lawrence come together about a minute and a half into the development, and we hear these two things. And and that climactic section of the development leads back to the recapitulation. And so the first theme comes in, and we recapitulate the feud theme. Then there's a bridge, and yes, we recapitulate the love theme. And the love theme here and the recapitulation builds to a wonderful climax. And yeah, it still brings tears to my eyes, even though I've heard this thing 100,000 times. So, you know, gosh, this thing is played somewhere every day, somewhere in the world. It's constantly being played. It is an absolute all-time favorite. And then we get this coda, and in the coda, what we hear is the lovers die, you know, and so the lovers die in the coda, and the timpani basically begins a funeral march, and so we have this funeral march that we hear, you know, broken fragments of the love theme as the funeral march continues, and then the harp comes out, and we hear this apotheosis of the lovers. The lovers go to heaven, and they live forever in our hearts. And so we hear the harp basically symbolizing that, with the very high pitched sounds in the strings, and that end this wonderful concert overture. A concert overture stands alone. There's nothing that follows it necessarily. So you basically can just play the concert overture by itself, and it's no big deal. So that's when this ends. There's not another movement that's going to begin or anything. So that's the overture to Romeo and Juliet. The people keep writing concertos during the 19th century, and they're still writing them today. Uh, and so Mendelssohn composed concertos, piano concertos, this violin concerto we're going to hear. Uh, certainly Tchaikovsky composed some wonderful concertos, wonderful violin concertos, a couple of piano concertos. The piano concerto number 1 is done all the time. It's another warhorse, so-called. Brahms composed concertos, piano and violin, and a double concerto for violin and cello. Wonderful piece. So these composers are writing these concertos, and uh, so, and really this double exposition sonata form continues here. So we are going to get double exposition sonata right through the 19th century, and it's slightly different than it might have been earlier. But yeah, this is a piece for solo instrument and orchestra, and we get these touring professionals who play these things. Liszt played his concertos to show off. And of course, we get Paganini, the great violinist, who it was rumored that Paganini sold his soul to the devil. And Paganini played into that as a marketing strategy and named his violin the devil. So the violin is still around, even though Paganini is not. And he wrote music for himself to play. He also played some of these concertos, and so it goes on and on. And um, yeah, Felix, you got a biography of Felix Mendelssohn on page 202 and 203 of your textbook, and Mendelssohn was another one of these wunderkinds, um, and he was a big friend of Queen Victoria of England. He wrote music for her to play, and uh, and they commissioned works by Mendelssohn, uh, and so we're going to see that in the movie you're going to watch for the discussion post. And so, but these artists in the 19th century, they play pretty well. So these touring professionals really have some serious abilities on their respective instruments, and the concertos are designed to show that off. In addition to basically being wonderful music. So virtuosity is an element in a lot of these concertos, and the idea is to make it difficult but musical. And Mendelssohn achieved that brilliantly in this violin concerto. Um, so on page 204, you have the listening guide to the concerto. And it's about a 12-minute long concerto. And you'll notice this movement is in double exposition sonata form, but it's not quite as formal as a Mozart concerto would be, where you get the orchestra and then the soloist, playing the themes of the thing. Here they're intertwined, so the thing begins with the violin. That tune, and then the orchestra plays it, and you have a transition to the second theme. Um, and a development. You notice that in this concerto, the cadenza for the violin is at the end of the development. In the Mozart that we listened to, it was at the end of the recapitulation. For some reason, Mendelssohn puts the cadenza at the end of the development, and then we get the recapitulation with these themes and a coda. So, and again, this thing is done constantly. It's done all the time. So listen and enjoy. The 19th century is more secular than even the Viennese classical period. You know, Haydn composed mass settings, as did Mozart and Beethoven. But in the 19th century, we don't see quite as much sacred music. The um, Occasionally, composers would compose things for different reasons. Verdi's wonderful setting of the Requiem, the Latin Requiem Mass, is kind of an exception to that. Verdi wrote it because this great Italian nationalist poet, Manzoni, had died, and they needed something for his funeral. But they also wanted a national Italian piece that would demonstrate how great, Italian music could be. And of course, actually, there's nothing new. The Italian music has been great for generations by the time Verdi comes along. But now that Italy is a country, we need sort of a national rallying point. And so the Verdi Requiem is an effort to achieve that, and it does. Okay, it's a great piece. And but what a monster piece! The chorus is enormous, with a huge orchestra and soloists, and it is not really so much a church service as it is sort of a sacred opera. Um, Very operatic, very melodramatic, especially when we get to the Dies Irae and the Tuba Mirum, the last trumpet sounding. Boy, do you hear that last trumpet. Um, Anton Bruckner was a very religious Catholic, so we see him doing a number of mass settings. And we get Brahms up north. Brahms was born in Hamburg. You should have you've got a biography here on page 208 of Johannes Brahms. And he mainly is famous for chamber music, his four symphonies, and his concertos. He didn't write. He wrote some songs and the love song waltzes. Those are choral pieces with piano four hands. But the songs and the waltzes are secular songs. He always said bad poets. He very rarely said a good poet. I don't know why. He said they didn't need his help. So, he, and boy, did he set some people that needed help. I'll tell you. But here, Brahms turns to the German translation of the Bible, the Old and New Testaments, in order to create a requiem that is, and he calls it ein deutsches Requiem, which means a German requiem. So this is a uniquely German piece. Does it have anything to do with the German nation forming? Well, maybe tangentially. Uh, it's I don't think it's completely related to that, but maybe to an extent it is. But what Brahms did is he assembled scriptures that appealed to him uh, as he experienced grief and loss, and strung them together in various ways. And two of the movements that I can think of are movements that are similar to the Fifth Symphony because they take you from this dark place, a very dark place, and they gradually, over a period of 10, 12 minutes, move to a place of triumph and light. And these two movements end with these wonderful fugues. The righteous are in the hands of God, and nothing will trouble them. And what a wonderful fugue that is setting those words from the Old Testament. And so here we've got, and you notice on page 209 of your textbook, it's got the Catholic, Roman Catholic text, Requiem aeternam dona eis Domine, give them eternal rest. And then Brahms kind of has a version of that taken from the German translation of the Bible. Selig sind die da Leid tragen, denn sie sollen getröstet werden. Yeah, uh, it's from the Beatitudes in the Gospel of Matthew. Blessed are they that mourn, for they shall be comforted. So yeah, and then so um, we've got the first movement beginning with that, just like grant them eternal rest, or Lord, right? He's got this from the Beatitudes. So there's some parallels here between the Latin Requiem and this German text. So here on page 209 and 210, we have got the listening guide for the fourth movement of the German Requiem. And it's the 84th Psalm from the Old Testament. How lovely are your dwellings, O Lord of hosts. And you'll notice here as it takes you through this that it is a rather, it's a rondo form. So we have this tune, Wie lieblich sind deine Wohnungen, Herr Zebaoth. That is the tune that keeps coming back. It's the A tune. So the A section, soft, peaceful orchestra with chorus. And then the B section comes in, saying, Meine Seele verlanget und sehnet sich nach dem Verhöfen des Herrn. My soul longs and thirsts for the courts of the living God. And so that's the B section. Then A comes back briefly, and we get a wonderful, at 350, we get a wonderful C section, which is turns into a fugue. Okay, so it's everything's been homophonic up to the C section at 350, and we get Die loben dich immer da, we praise you forevermore. And so we get this, that becomes the subject of a fugue. And there's a brief little sort of fugal section before we return back to the homophonic A section of Wie lieblich. So listen and enjoy this fourth movement from Brahms' German Requiem. The next chapter are these late Romantic symphonies, where the orchestra becomes this monster thing, 120 to 130, even more. So we get these composers writing for these huge orchestras. This, again, is a very opulent period in European history, Western European especially. The Industrial Revolution has created a burgeoning middle class and a burgeoning upper class, and these people demand more and more from the orchestra, and so these composers give that to them in these wonderful symphonic masterpieces that are still done today everywhere. But this is a very very different kind of period. I mean, the French call it la belle époque, the beautiful epoch. And so, you get this feeling of opulence. Of course, Mark Twain in the United States called it the Gilded Age. So, as these industrialists become very incredibly wealthy and everyone else is in abject poverty. And that leads to a lot of political movements like populism in America. So, we've got a second Gilded Age. We're right in the middle of it right now. So you've got this this wonderful opulent period in Western European history. It's going to end. Don't worry. It's going to come to a screeching halt in 1914, if not before. But here during this people, and of course, like people today, they thought it would never end. This is going to go on like this forever. Well, it didn't. But while it's going on, there's some pretty glorious music being written, and being written all across Europe. So the first guy that we're going to talk about, we're not going to go in order here in your textbook, but you've got a biography of Dvorak on page 215 of your textbook. And Dvorak would never have gotten anywhere if it hadn't been for Brahms. Brahms loved his music and championed his music. Dvorak, like Smetana, was a Czech nationalist. And he spent about 2 years teaching at Columbia University in New York, and had a number of American students. And one of them was Harry T. Burleigh, an African American. And Dvorak encouraged Burleigh to collect the folk songs of his people. And so we get, from Burleigh, we get a huge collection of African American spirituals. And so we owe a great debt of a great debt to Harry T. Burleigh and to Dvorak, who encouraged him in that work. He was a fabulous musician. In fact, he applied for a job as choir master at St. George's Episcopal Church, and the vestry thought he was just fine musically, but he was black, and they were cautious about that. They wondered what kind of message it would send if they hired a black choir master. But the head of the vestry, the chief warden of the vestry, was a guy named J.P. Morgan, and he kind of bankrolled the church because he was a banker and he had a lot of money. So Morgan said, "Yeah, we're going to hire him," and they said, "Aye, aye, sir." And so Harry T. Burleigh, while he was studying in New York, also enjoyed this paid position as the choir master at St. George's. Nevertheless, we've got this wonderful New World Symphony. This is a tribute to Dvorak's visit in America. And so the final movement of this symphony is a large sonata form. We have a basic, a very brief two-note introduction here. And if it sounds like Jaws, well, it is Jaws. John Williams basically took the theme for Jaws from the exposition, from the introduction here to the exposition of the New World Symphony. Okay, there it is. And then the theme, of course, stated marcato in the brass, dum bum 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 bum. So yeah, so that's a great theme. John Williams didn't use it. I don't know why. He should have. And then a bridge. And the second theme is this triplet theme in violins, woodwinds, and with a cymbal crash. And then the clarinet comes in and sings this, plays this tender melodic idea. Da da dee da dee da dee da dee da dee da da dee dee da dee da dee da dee. And then theme 3. Again, it's one of these fake folk songs like we heard with Smetana, and with repeated notes and this triplet idea. And at the end here, the very end of this thing is this 3-note downward scale, pum 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 pum, and it sounds like 3 blind mice. It may be 3 blind mice. I don't know. So the 3-note idea, though, continues on into the development. And so we hear that the 3-note idea is developed, and then what happens is you haven't heard the other 3 movements of this symphony, but Dvorak begins to recall the other 3 movements, and so in the middle of the development, track 26, we get this going home melody. Da da dee da dee da dee dee da dee. So you hear a fragment of that melody. That's from the second movement of the symphony. And then you also hear part of the scherzo as this thing gets going. So the scherzo is the third movement. So he kind of recapitulates the whole symphony here in a lot of ways. And we'll hear part of the first movement as well. So he recapitulates this, march-like theme from theme 1 with the trombones instead of trumpets, and then, of course, the very nice conjunct melody of the second theme comes back, and then the folk-like third theme is recapitulated, and he gets through that to get to the coda. And the coda contains kind of a second development. And so about 16 seconds in, you hear bum, 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 the first theme from the first movement. So that's the first movement comes back here in this second development here. And then the going home fragment at 55 seconds, that's the second movement. So he basically gives you bits and pieces of the whole symphony to kind of end the symphony. It's kind of a good idea. And then you get a second recapitulation where the first and fourth movement themes the first themes of both movements are stated at the same time to kind of wind this movement up and wind the symphony up. So it's a great piece. I hope you enjoy it. Okay, so we're going to flip back a couple of pages and talk about Brahms' Symphony Number 4. Brahms is very different. This fourth movement of the Fourth Symphony is absolute music, and so there's no program. And that's really interesting because in the 19th century, almost everything had to have a program. So if you're writing a symphony, you have to write a program for the symphony. It doesn't matter if it's really what you had in mind or not. It has to have a program. Brahms refused to do this. Um, and so, you know, he also refused to write an opera. The closest he came to an opera was the German Requiem. So, yeah, he's a very different composer in this period. He also looks to the past for inspiration. And this is interesting. You know, you don't see a lot of 19th century composers doing that unless it's an opera plot. You know, so we set the opera in the Middle Ages. But Brahms looks to actual composers of the past. He was very inspired by the music of Heinrich Schütz, who lived 100 years, almost exactly 100 years before J.S. Bach. He's also inspired by Bach, of course. So here with this Symphony Number 4, we get a Baroque form, and we've heard this form before with Dido and Danaeus, this ground bass. Well, a chaconne is kind of the same idea. It's in this case, it's an 8-bar long repeating chord pattern that he employs to do this. So yeah, Brahms only got around to composing 4 symphonies because he's haunted by the ghost of Beethoven. And he worked on his first symphony for 20 years. So he was even more deliberate in his process of composing than Beethoven had been. Because, you know, 9 symphonies wasn't a lot, you know, compared to Mozart and Haydn for Beethoven. But here Brahms only composed 4, you know, and he leaves you here with this last movement of the fourth symphony. He leaves you wanting more. Every time I hear this, I wish he'd written more symphonies because it's wonderful. And so here we have, and you notice this this chord pattern is the line of a basso continuo from one of Bach's cantatas, the cantata number 150. So here he's actually quoting something that Bach wrote here, and so we get this chaconne theme. And so you'll notice here that the chaconne theme comes in has 30 variations. So he states the theme at the beginning, and then there are 30 variations, but they're grouped into kind of 3 parts. So the A section, you see these 11 variations in A, and they are at a rather rapid tempo, okay? So there you have this allegro, energico, e passionato. So you've got this, that. Then here at the B section, you've got 4 variations, but they're half as fast as the A sections. So it takes as much time to get through these 4 as it would to get through 8 at the fast tempo. So you've got the 12, 13, 14, and 15, much slower, but still this same chord progression underlies that. It's just twice as slow. Then we return for A with variation 16, where we hear the opening chaconne theme again, and we hear these next variations on that chaconne theme. Still that same 8-bar pattern underneath. You can hear it, and then we get a coda at 9:29. So this is a wonderful work of genius by Johannes Brahms. Mahler was a Viennese composer right at the end of the 19th century. And you have a biography of Mahler here on page 217 of your textbook. And Mahler's wow, Mahler's music is grandiose. It's huge. Uh, just like Wagner, when we get to the opera here in a minute, you know, Mahler's music is has this grand design to it. It's amazing. Very large orchestra, lots of interesting orchestrations, but a lot of times the music is kind of simple. It's folksy, especially the first symphony. So when we listen to the first symphony, it's called the Titan Symphony. And oh, by the way, I always associate Mahler with Gustav Klimt. Klimt and Mahler lived about the same time during this very opulent era in Vienna, and Klimt used gold leaf to decorate his paintings. And the models are actual, influential people taken from influential families in Austria around the year 1900. And so, yeah, so this Mahler piece, I don't know, I think of Klimt whenever I hear Mahler. But this Mahler piece is in 4 sections. And the first section is just this Frere Jacques in a minor key. You've heard, "Are you sleeping? Are you sleeping, brother John?" Okay, that's the tune, except it's mine. And it becomes a round, just like "Are You Sleeping, Brother John" is a round. So we hear that minor version of Frere Jacques. And double bass players and tuba players love Mahler because they get to play the tunes. They don't just play oompa all the time. So you hear this double bass playing Frere Jacques and then bassoon, then the tuba enters, and then the oboe and flute get it, and then so yeah, so we have that first section. And then the second section is this dance-like melody played by oboes, joined by trumpets, um, and various other things. And section 3, there's another Klimt. uh, Section 3 is faster and lighter with a lonely sounding melody, muted strings, flute, oboe, clarinet, horns, and yeah. And then we go back in section 4 to another statement of Frere Jacques. So I guess you would call it ABCA. I don't know. So that's the Mahler um, piece. Even his song cycles are really symphonies. Okay, the Kindertotenlieder, das Lied von der Erde, and Lieder eines fahrenden Gesellen. These are all um, really symphonies disguised as song cycles. I kid you not. So, so yeah, he wrote a lot more than just 9 symphonies. He was working on his 10th symphony. He was criticized for working on a 10th symphony. How dare you write more than 9? Because Beethoven only wrote 9. But he died before he could finish it. There you go. So that is Mahler and the third movement of the first symphony. Opera. Opera was made for the 19th century. These opera theaters are being built and they're getting larger and more elaborate, more ornate here in the 19th century. Uh, and again, it's the whole object is to bring in more people, sell more tickets, get more people seated in seats to watch something. So there is a business model and a marketing plan here, just like there was with the music in the concert hall. So, and since nationalism is a big thing, we get the development of national styles. Verdi and Bellini, Rossini, these Italian opera composers develop a consummate Italian form of opera. Not that that's unusual. Italian opera conquered all of Europe in the 17th century, but now it's much more. They're much more interested in writing for Italians, and so we get this Italian opera style. And in Germany, of course, Wagner and later on Richard Strauss develop uniquely German form of opera, and we're going to listen to that. Um, Wagner became the musical voice of German nationalism, for better or for worse, and sometimes it was for worse. Um, in France, we get uh, just a continuation of what Louis XIV started when he established a French form of opera, the tragédie lyrique. We're going to get, composers like Bizet um, and Massenet and these opera composers in France writing in a uniquely French style. So we get these, and yeah, Manuel de Falla in Spain composed Spanish opera. Okay, so so uh, we've got uh, we've got these national styles that develop here with the rise of nationalism. But as the theaters get bigger and the orchestras get bigger, how can the puny singer be heard? Well, that's the question. Uh, in the 17th and 18th centuries, the orchestras are small, the halls are not as big. So and of course you had the castrati who could be heard. I mean, you may not like the sound, but you're going to hear it. Uh, Now we don't have castrati anymore, so we don't have these tall men with female voices. So what are we doing? How are we going to be heard? And so they developed this art of singing called bel canto, which simply means beautiful singing, but it's just a way of projecting your voice without creating vocal problems, because these singers in the 19th century, they didn't have like unions and that stipulated how many times a week they could sing and this sort of thing. They were up there on the stage 7 days a week. uh, uh, Streponi sang when she was, honest to God, 8 months pregnant. She was performing Norma when she was 8 months pregnant. So as long as you could get up on stage and sing, by gosh, it didn't matter. You're going to be there. And so, how can you preserve your voice so that you can, do the same thing tomorrow night and the night after and the night after? And that's how they developed this singing technique called bel canto, and you hear it still used today by the best singers. So get ready, you're going to hear it now. Uh, Carmen and the Pearl Fishers are examples of exoticism, uh, exploring faraway lands. This was part of the marketing plan. Uh, and believe it or not, Italian opera, a lot of the operas are set in Scotland because it was far away and it was exotic, believe it or not. And so, so we get the Lady of the Lake by Rossini and Lucia di Lammermoor by Donizetti, set in Scotland, because that seemed exotic to Italian opera goers in Venice and Milan and elsewhere. So, and then Bizet sets Carmen in Spain, which isn't that far away, but it seemed exotic to the French. The Pearl Fishers, though, is set in India, and so that is an exotic location if there ever was one. Not that they knew anything about India or how people in India were. That has nothing to do with it. So it's the 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 knowledge of these places is far from perfect, far from complete. So they're basically just French singers singing a French opera that happens to be set in India, okay, or Spain or Scotland. But there is this sense of exoticism as part of the marketing plan. People are going to show up to see an opera set in a faraway land. Yeah. Jenny Lind, Maria Malibran, Pauline Viardot. These are all these famous women singers who applied their trade on the stage. Now that the castrati are gone, we have plenty of women performing on the opera stage. Streponi, uh, Verdi's second wife. For a long time, she was his mistress, and then he married her. And she got to know Verdi because she was a soprano singer. So she was basically um, singing, and Verdi met her, and his first wife, had died in an epidemic, so she became his mistress and later his second wife. Well, Verdi, you can't get more Italian than Verdi. There is Giuseppe Verdi, a photograph of him on the left, and on the right is Strepponi, his second wife. So Verdi's life is tied up with Italian nationalism. His first big success, operatic success, was an opera called Nabucco about the Hebrew slaves living in Babylon. And there's a chorus called uh, Va Pensiero, uh, which means, "Oh, my thoughts go on golden wings to my home." And they sing this. These Hebrew slaves sing this in Babylon, longing for their home in Jerusalem. So, but it wasn't really about Hebrew slaves longing for a home in Jerusalem. It was about Italians longing for their own country. And every Italian who heard this got it. In fact, even in rehearsal, everybody stopped working on the set when the first time they heard this, and it brought tears to the eyes of the people working there because of this desire for an Italian nation. So, yeah, so that first opera was thinly disguised Italian nationalism, and there were many others after that. And so and Verdi even served in the first parliament in Italy as the country was being unified. They decided to have a parliamentary system of government, and Verdi was elected to the parliament to serve as a representative. It didn't last long. He was not a very good politician, but nevertheless, he became a national symbol for Italian nationalism. And he chiefly composed opera. There is nobody better at writing a tune than Giuseppe Verdi, with the possible exception of Mozart. Uh, uh, this guy could write tunes that will stick in your head forever. Um, so, um, and many of his tunes, you probably know them, you just didn't know they were by Verdi. uh, La Donna Immobile is a good example. You hear this tune, La Donna Immobile, qual piuma il vento, muta d'accento e di pensiero. Who hasn't heard that tune? And so, uh, yeah, and that's Verdi. And there's dozens and dozens of others. I know a lot of them, so don't get me started. So Verdi had a long career. He was born in 1813. I think he died in the 1890s. So he had a very long career composing opera. And, during the 1840s, he would compose an opera almost every 6 months. A lot of those operas are not done anymore. A few of them are revived every once in a while. But he hit the jackpot with three operas in the early 1850s. Il Trovatore, Rigoletto, and La Traviata. These three operas are done all the time because they're just wonderful. The tunes are great. The music is wonderful. The drama is tight. They tell these stories so beautifully, especially Traviata and Rigoletto. Those two are just really tight dramas. So it's really worth your time to see one of these big three. And Verdi became so wealthy off of these three operas that he could slow down his composition process and be more careful about writing. And that means that he created a number of fantastic masterpieces after about 1855. One of them is one we're going to listen to, Aida. Um, there were enough Europeans living in Cairo by the 1860s that they built an opera house, and they commissioned Verdi to write an opera for this opera house in Cairo. Now, Egyptians are not interested in Italian opera, but this is for Europeans. And so Verdi composed this opera. set in ancient Egypt. And so, uh, and the plot is really kind of a typical Italian opera plot. The uh, slave girl, Aida, is really a princess in disguise. Her father, Amonasro, is king of the Nubians. The Nubians have been defeated by the Egyptians, and they've taken Aida prisoner and enslaved her to the powerful Egyptian princess Amneris. Amneris doesn't know that Aida and the Egyptian general Radames are in love. So, um, and when she finds out, she's not going to be real happy about it because she also is in love with Radames. Um, well, Aida, at her father's behest, has Radames reveal where the Egyptian army is going so that the Nubians can ambush them and defeat them and return Nubia to freedom. Amneris hears this and she calls the local priests, who I guess are also the police, and Radames is condemned to death. And they execute these people by having them suffocate to death under the statue in a chamber underneath the statue of the Egyptian god Ptah. So, and the opera ends with this wonderful duet that we're going to hear. It's called O Terra Dio, which means goodbye, cruel earth. And you've got a translation of this on your listening guide along with timings. It's on page 226 of your textbook. So we're going to hear this. Verdi, after Aida and Aida, Verdi went on to compose these Shakespeare operas. So in the 1870s, he composed Otello, which is a fabulous masterpiece. And then right before he died in the 1880s and 90s, he composed Falstaff, which is a kind of a combination of Henry IV and Merry Wives of Windsor. So you see, and you shouldn't pass up an opportunity to hear either one of those operas. They're fabulous, fabulous works. So here is O Terra Dio. It's a trio. We start out with Aida singing her this tune, O Terra Dio, Dio Valle di Pianti. This is a very disjunct melody. And of course, why is it disjunct? Well, they're dying. And of course, you have to suspend a little disbelief here. They're suffocating to death, but they can still sing. So, yeah. And Radames comes in and sings the tune. Then they sing it together. And in the background, you hear the priests chanting and Amneris basically asking for, pardon from her beloved Isis goddess because she realizes that she has done these people in and it's unjust, et cetera, et cetera. So it's the finale to the last act of Aida. And of course, Elton John took on the subject recently. And no, it's not as good as Verdi, but nevertheless, he made more money than Verdi, I think. So here is the finale to Act 3. Listen to it and enjoy. I'm going to skip a little bit in the textbook now to talk about German opera and Wagner. Richard Wagner is a fascinating character. You don't have to like him. He was megalomaniac. He borrowed money and never returned it. And sadly, he was voraciously anti-Semitic. One of his biographers that I read said it's tragic to see the depths to which a great mind can stoop. And that is an apt description of Wagner's anti-Semitism. But he was also really a great musical genius who changed music in a lot of ways and created a kind of a musical revolution here. He was born the same year as Verdi in 1813, and exhibited a talent for music early on. went to France to study a little bit, and a lot of his ideas came from Berlioz. When we talked about the idée fixe idea, that the recurring theme that keeps coming back during the Symphonie Fantastique, well, Wagner took that idea and ran with it. And he returned to Germany, became a Kapellmeister uh, in uh, East Prussia and then in Saxony. And in 1848, he participated in this revolution. Um, and since he was kind of implicated in treasonous activities, he had to flee the country. Well, a lot of Germans did. Many of them ended up in the United States. Some of them were Civil War generals, believe it or not. But Wagner didn't go to America. He went to Switzerland and was in exile in Switzerland for about 20 years. And while there, he composed his great masterpiece, the Der Ring des Nibelungen, the Ring of the Nibelungs. And we're going to hear the final scene from this series of operas. There are four of these operas, and so we call it the Ring Cycle. And they basically involve this plot that if you forge this ring out of the gold in the Rhine, guarded by the Rhine maidens, you can have all the power in the world. So everyone is after the ring, and oh, by the way, it's cursed. The first owner of the ring puts a curse on it that everyone who has it will die, and yeah, they do. So this goes from hand to hand to hand, and everybody who has it dies. And eventually, the ring goes back to its original owners, the Rhine maidens. And it happens when Brünnhilde throws herself and her poor horse onto the funeral pyre of the hero Siegfried, and they all burn up, and the ring goes back to the Rhine maidens. Okay, so that's it. Well, this crazy king, Ludwig II in Munich, he was the king of Bavaria, I think he heard Lohengrin, which was one of Wagner's earlier operas, and he fell in love with Wagner. He thought Wagner was the greatest. And they exchanged letters, and eventually Ludwig brought Wagner to Munich to do a ring cycle. Ludwig was the guy who built Neuschwanstein. If you've ever seen a travel poster of Germany, you'll see Neuschwanstein. It's a kind of a castle. It's Ludwig's idea of what a medieval castle would be like. And inside the castle, there are all these uh, frescoes, and the frescoes are all scenes from Wagner operas. That's how crazy Ludwig was about Wagner. These building projects literally bankrupted his kingdom, and Ludwig died a very mysterious death. He drowned along with his doctor mysteriously, and no one's really quite sure whether he drowned by himself or he had some help from the Prussians, who eventually took over Bavaria and incorporated it into the German Reich. Uh, so Ludwig got into trouble, though. There was a tax revolt in Munich, so he had to basically tell Wagner to, leave town. And Wagner left town and went to this little bitty town named Bayreuth. It's still in Bavaria, but it's sort of on the edge of the Kingdom of Bavaria and near the Czech border there. And there, Wagner took up collections and built his theater. So Bayreuth every summer has a festival, a Wagner festival, where they have really great Wagner singers from all over, and they come and they produce these Wagner operas. Okay, here's where the plot gets sadly very interesting. By the 1920s, Bayreuth is having financial problems. Wagner's son, Siegfried, had married a British woman who loved Germany so much and loved Wagner so much that she literally forgot how to speak English and spoke only German the rest of her life. Her name was Winifred. So Siegfried and Winifred Wagner were trying to put on these operas, but they're running out of money until they have this visitor. And he's increasingly popular because he is a very popular politician. You may have heard of him. His name was Adolf Hitler. So Hitler shows up at Bayreuth, and pretty soon everybody in the Nazi Party is coming to Bayreuth, and they make generous donations, they buy tickets, they buy Wagner, you know, stuff, and yeah, everybody is just madly. All of a sudden, Bayreuth is saved, and it becomes a going concern. People show up there, and yeah, Winifred just loved Wagner, and she loved Hitler. And to her dying day, she insisted that Hitler wasn't responsible for the Holocaust, believe it or not. So yeah, there's this kind of strange connection. Now, Wagner himself died long before Hitler. He died about time Hitler was born. So he doesn't have anything directly to do, but, he was anti-Semitic. And so Hitler just basically took up where he left off, sadly. Um, and Wagner's grandson, Wieland, remembers vividly sitting on Hitler's knee. They called him Uncle Adolf. Okay. So after World War II, Bayreuth had this legacy to live down. And Wieland basically uh, did his best to try to erase that. You can't ever get totally rid of it. But Wagner is still popular today. The music is glorious. So you have to separate the man, I guess, from his music. Sometimes it's hard to do. Um, Other times you just sit or bask in the glory of the beauty of what he created. So this is a complex person uh, writing complex music. And what Wagner did musically is kind of fascinating. You have a biography of Wagner on pages 234, 235, 236, and 237. And it talks about the creation of Bayreuth um, and how that Wagner composed these operas. The operas are through composed, so you're not going to see, like in Mozart, we have a double aria. In Handel, we've got the ternary form, the da capo aria. These forms, but Wagner throws all of that out. The operas are through composed. There's no regular sort of repetition and contrast. Um, but there is a lot of repetition in terms of the plot lines. So Wagner basically creates these plot lines, and he basically constructs these tunes that are musical symbols. They stand for a prop, or they stand for a character. They stand for a plot situation, and it's on and on and on. The tunes occur, believe it or not, in the orchestra for the most part. Only rarely do singers get to sing these tunes. They're called leitmotif. A leitmotif is just a musical symbol. It's a tune that stands for a plot, like the spear. Wotan, the head of the gods, has a spear. And the spear is a very important sort of symbol uh, in this opera. And the leitmotif for the spear is just this descending minor scale. Bum, 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 bum. That's it. So, yeah. And then Siegmund has the sword. He pulls the sword out of the the uh, the trunk of a big tree, and he holds it up, and he calls the sword Notung. Needful means needful. And bum 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 bum. There's the tune for the sword. The ring, da dee da dee da dee da. It's a diminished seventh chord going up and down. And so you have all of these leitmotifs. And the one you're going to hear a lot in the finale to Götterdämmerung here is the redemption. Da dee da dee da dee dee da. In Wagner operas, women redeem the world by killing themselves. Don't ask me why. Okay, this is pure 19th century romanticism. Women have to die to redeem everything. Don't try this at home. Okay, it doesn't work. But nevertheless, so you have this idea uh, that putting women on a pedestal is very Victorian, and so the harmonies are endlessly chromatic. Wagner never stays in the same key for more than a few measures, so it's constantly changing key. In Tristan, he really takes it and goes crazy with it. The opening theme to Tristan starts with a chromatic scale, da dee da dee, and then it changes key immediately. Okay, so and what a wonderful piece of music it is. It's just glorious. I'm going to see it this summer. Ha 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 ha. So anyway, this and of course Tolkien used the same sorts of uh, sources that Wagner did for the Lord of the Rings. But the Lord of the Rings has some major differences here from uh, uh, from the Ring cycle, uh, and I'm not going to get into all of that. But we're going to listen to the immolation scene. It's called. You've heard it. You know, you've heard the saying, "Don't. It's not over until the fat lady sings." Well, this is it. This is the fat lady singing. Okay, except a lot of times they're not fat. Okay, don't get the idea they're always fat. But yeah, um, I describe this plot here. The plot is simply that the ring is cursed and everybody wants it, and everybody who has it will die. And uh, the king of the gods eventually gets it by stealing it from Alberich, the evil dwarf, and yeah, but he has to pay the giants with the ring, and so the giant, I think Fafnir, turns himself into a dragon and guards the ring for years and years and years. Siegfried, the great hero, who is really Wotan's grandson, that gets complicated too. Uh, Finally, kills the giant and gets the ring and rescues the Valkyrie Brynhilde from her prison. Wotan has to put her to sleep, and she sleeps on top of this mountain for 20 years, ringed by fire. Siegfried makes his way through the fire and rescues her, and so yeah. So in the final opera, Siegfried betrays Brunhilde uh, because the evil Hagen is in league with his father Alberich to get the ring. Siegfried has the ring. They give him a love potion or something that causes him to forget Brunhilde, and he marries Gutrune. Well, Brunhilde is not happy, so she kills Siegfried, and then they arrange they have a nice funeral scene where Siegfried has a funeral, and then he's going to be burned. His body is going to be burned on this funeral pyre, and Brunhilde gets on her horse. The horse's name is Grane, by the way, and she and the horse jump onto the funeral pyre and burn themselves up along with Siegfried, and the ring returns to the Rhine maidens. So the Rhine maidens finally get it back, and in the distance, the hall of the gods that Wotan built is on fire. So that's why they call it the Twilight of the Gods, Die Götterdämmerung. Wonderful German. So on page 238, you do have a listening guide to this opera, and listen for these leitmotifs. So you're going to hear the ride of the Valkyries, dun, 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 dun. Of course, when Brunhilde gets onto her horse, you hear that, and she talks about this. Do you know where you're going, my friend? And she's talking to the horse, and yes, you're going into the fire. And poor Grane, the horse, probably is wondering what the hell's going on. But nevertheless, they jump into the fire, and yeah, and so you read this translation and listen, and of course you're going to hear the redemption theme, da, dee, 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 da, dee, dee, da. And it starts off with the spear, dum, bum, 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 bum. So you'll hear these leitmotifs as you listen to this, and that's how Wagner composes these operas. He just strings these things together uh, according to what's going on in the plot. These are These are the frescoes that decorate the walls of Neuschwanstein. So when you when you go into Neuschwanstein, you'll be able to see these things. So if you take a tour, oh no, by the way, Walt Disney used Neuschwanstein as the model for his Disney castle. So when you go to Disney World, you'll see the Disney castle, and that's really Walt Disney's idea of Neuschwanstein. Okay, crazy King Ludwig. Okay, so here is the listening example, Grana mein Ross. So you've got it in your listening things. Um, that's another fresco from the Neuschwanstein walls, and so you've got this piece here. So listen and enjoy. It's really quite impressive, and you'll notice here that the orchestra is huge. We have about 100 pieces in the pit, and again, you just have one soprano. So how do you can be heard above this orchestra? Well, that's not for everybody. You have to have a certain kind of voice, uh, which is louder than heck. So you don't be standing next to these people in an opera because it'll blow your eardrums out. I kid you not. But yeah, they're up against a huge orchestra, and they don't even get the tunes. In Verdi, right, the singers sing the tunes, and the orchestra goes boom chink underneath. Uh, Here, with Wagner, the orchestra gets the tunes. In fact, you can basically just turn off the singers and listen to the orchestra, and you get the plot. So the orchestra gets these leitmotifs for the most part, and the singers accompany the orchestra. So he turns it upside down, and that's kind of interesting. So everything happens in the orchestra, and so the stuff is going on stage, but you're listening to the orchestra, and they're telling you what's happening. John Williams uses that in Star Wars. So we have leitmotifs that John Williams created in Star Wars uh, for the Star Wars movies. It's just a great way to write a film score. What the heck, because all an opera is just an ancestor of Hollywood film stuff. So yeah. So here, listen to Grana mein Ross. Wagner died in the city of Venice in the 1880s, and there is a picture I took of this plaque commemorating Wagner's death. It's on the Venetian Casino, the gambling place. You have to be careful how you pronounce that in Italian, and but nevertheless, this commemorates Wagner's death in Venice. So again, I'm mentioning the Belle Epoque again because when we get to this opulent era that precedes World War One, we get these mammoth kinds of compositions. Richard Strauss and his music, his tone poems, and his operas that sort of go along with Wagner earlier. Uh, the Impressionist painters Monet, Degas, Gauguin, sculptures like Rodin. Uh, so these are all, kind of these people living in this opulent age, and painting these marvelous works of art and sculptures, and it's really they thought it would never end, but boy did it ever end. So in French they call it the Belle Epoque, um, and there you see a Gauguin painting. Gauguin, of course, was a big friend of Van Gogh. Uh, there you see the cathedral that Van Gogh painted. We went to Amsterdam back in 2017, and wow, they got a wonderful museum there dedicated totally to Van Gogh. Van Gogh committed his suicide and willed all his paintings to his brother, and his brother established this museum there. It's right by the Concertgebouw uh, orchestra hall, concert hall in Amsterdam. So if you're ever there, then don't miss the Van Gogh Museum. It's fabulous. Gustav Klimt, that we've mentioned before in Austria. There you see a painting that's in the Austrian Art Museum, and he designed paintings uh, on the walls. These are like frescoes at different parts of the museum to introduce to organize these collections. So fabulous, fabulous painter. And of course, we can't leave England out. There's the star of Downton Abbey. This is the mansion that the Carnarvon family built. And they had it remodeled. And if it looks like the Houses of Parliament, well, that's not an accident. It's designed by the same architect who did the Houses of Parliament. Okay. So these people are fabulously wealthy. They had hundreds of servants. And the story of Downton Abbey is essentially how they cope with the massive changes that came as a result of World War One and the 20th century, and how the family is living in this kind of dream world, thinking that this era of prosperity will never end, and it does. So how do you deal with that? So it's really, and this is the star really, this building, and it's quite a building. It's amazing. In Italy, in the late 19th, early 20th century, we get this newer style of opera that they call verismo. Verismo is in Italian means realer than real. Well, it's opera, so trust me, it's not going to be real. But nevertheless, it involves instead of I don't know, instead of revolutions and some of the other subject matter that early 19th century composers employed, this is more of an emphasis on the common everyday people. So there is a kind of a democratic, if you will, uh, kind of emphasis here. And so, for instance, La Boheme is about these poor people living in Paris. One's a poet, another is a philosopher, another is a musician. And they're all broke. They're all trying to make a living as poet, philosopher, musician, but they're broke. And the poet meets this girl from upstairs, Mimi, and she's a seamstress, and she, unbeknownst to him at first, has tuberculosis. So she's slowly dying of TB, living in this cold apartment upstairs. And she comes to ask him for a light for her candle. And the poet Rodolfo falls madly in love with her instantaneously. And so it's the story of these people and how they're dealing with uh, poverty and illness and on and on and on. And they're not dealing with it very well. Okay. Life is difficult for these people, and so how do you cope with tragedy? And these are subjects that Puccini liked and basically created in his operas. He wrote quite a few operas, and they're wonderful operas full of great tunes, and they do incorporate a small amount of material that could be called leitmotif material, but not very much. Okay, so and again, the orchestra is somewhat large, but not as large as Wagner. So the singers have to be can still sing in a more florid Italian style, but they need some heft to their voices, not like Wagner, where the heft is all there is. But yeah, so we get a little bit heavier voice quality than say for Verdi or for especially Donizetti and Rossini. Um, but yeah, Madame Butterfly is a great Puccini opera about an American who marries a Japanese girl and has a child with her and then forgets about her and marries an American woman, and they come back, of course, to claim the child. They want the kid, they don't want her. And this Japanese woman commits suicide as a result. Very interesting opera, very interesting opera plot. Um, Tosca, wow, what an opera. Yeah, Tosca is an opera singer. Why not? Having an opera singer singing, and she's famous, a famous opera singer, and she loves Cavaradossi, the painter, but Scarpia suspects he's the evil chief of police in Rome, and he suspects Cavaradossi of committing treason. So, yes, he tortures Cavaradossi and has Tosca listen to it, and she reveals where the plotters are hiding as a result. And yes, Scarpia wants her to ransom her body in return for the safety of her lover Cavaradossi. But before Scarpia can finalize his lustful desires, she stabs him to death with a pair of scissors. And then on the at the roof of the Castel Sant'Angelo in Rome, Cavaradossi is there, ready to be shot at dawn. And Tosca shows up and says, "Don't worry, it's all going to be faked. You're going to live, and uh, we're going to be together forever. It's going to be wonderful." And so she says, just act the part. So when they come in to shoot you, they're shooting blanks. Well, unbeknownst to Tosca, they're not shooting blanks. So Cavaradossi stands up against the wall. The soldiers shoot him and kill him. And when she realizes that he's dead, she jumps off of the roof of the Castel Sant'Angelo to her death. And that's the end of Tosca. What an opera. I can't get enough of Tosca. Don't make me sing. Okay. So here is Si mi chiamano Mimi. And the translation of this is on page 230 of your textbook. And um, it's Rodolfo is already in love with Mimi when she sings this, but the rest of the audience falls madly in love with her when she sings this. Okay, because this is just such a charming piece. Well, and it's kind of a typical verismo kind of emphasis. They call me Mimi, but my real name's Lucia. I don't know why. La storia mia è breve a te. So there's nothing much to tell. I embroider silk and linen at home and outside. I'm contented and happy. It's my pleasure to make lilies and roses. Uh, and so, yeah, they call me Mimi. I don't know why. I'm all alone. I make dinner for myself. I don't always go to Mass, but I often pray to God. So she's just telling the story of her life. And she doesn't know this, but Rodolfo is falling more and more in love with her while she's just telling this silly little story about how she lives alone in this apartment. And but you fall in love with her, I think, when she sings "Ma quando vien los gelos, il primo sole mio, il primo bacio dell'amore mio." Right, when the thaw comes at the end of winter, the first sunlight is mine because I'm living on top and looking out over the roofs of Paris. Uh, the first kiss of sun is mine. Um, and yeah, it's just a wonderful lyric phrase there. So don't miss this wonderful aria, Si mi chiamano Mimi from La Boheme by Puccini.